I've got 2 points of order. I'll start with the Chief Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today on a point of order that is extremely serious. It concerns a matter that occurred at the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Mr. Speaker, the Chairman made a ruling that I submit violates the standing orders, violates the practices of this House and its committees, and violates the spirit of your ruling of March the 14th, 2008. The motion that was proposed to the committee was as follows, and I quote, "The Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics investigate the actions of the Conservative Party during the 2006 election, in relation to which Elections Canada has refused to reimburse Conservative candidates for certain election campaign expenses in order to determine if these actions meet the ethical standards expected of public office holders." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, the government argued that this study was outside of the mandate of that committee. It was argued that the proper committee for such a study was the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The mandate of Procedure and House Affairs is outlined in Standing Order 1083A6. It states that the mandate includes to review and report on all matters relating to the election of members to the House of Commons. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, the Chairman ignored the standing orders and ruled the motion in order. This same Chairman, supported by the same opposition majority on that committee, already had one report rejected by the Speaker because it was outside the mandate of the committee. And now they're doing it again. As you're aware, Mr. Speaker, the position of the Conservative Party in this matter is sound. If there is to be an investigation, that investigation ought to be fair and include all parties. This is a reasonable position. Apart from the issue of the mandate of the committee, we have no qualms with an investigation. We just think that if a study is to be conducted, then the study should include all parties and not just one. If the opposition has nothing to hide, then they ought to agree with our position. In addition to ruling the motion in order, the Chairman yesterday arbitrarily decided during debate on the motion that he'd heard enough and refused to recognize members who were seeking the floor on debate. Standing Order 116 states, and I quote, "In a standing, special or legislative committee, the standing order shall apply so far as may be applicable, except the standing order as to the number of times of speaking and the length of speeches." End of quote. The Chairman of the Ethics Committee has no authority to cut off debate. By overriding Standing Order 116, the Chairman went beyond the powers conferred upon him by the House. You made the exact same argument when you ruled a report signed by this same Chairman out of order because the committee went beyond the powers conferred upon it by the House. During the debate on the motion, the Chairman interrupted the debate and made the following statement, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, "Let's just take a moment here. We have had over 10 hours of debate on these motions, and it has deteriorated into procedural wrangling, points of order which are not points of order, repetition in the extreme, irrelevance on dealing with the matter before us. We could carry on like this, just as the Procedure and House Affairs Committee went for a very long time. I'm not sure that's in the best interest of this committee. I'm not sure whether I want to be part of where the members are going to continue to be put in this position where we are spinning our wheels. Accordingly, I'm going to rule that we are going to put all the questions necessary to dispose of the matter before us now." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, this decision was upheld by the committee. This, Mr. Speaker, must sound familiar to you. This trick has been used twice in the past, a trick that resulted in the Chairman in both cases offering their resignation. The Chairman in question in this incident has not offered his resignation. On March 21, 1990, a Liberal member raised a question of privilege concerning a similar matter that arose at the Standing Committee of Finance. At that time, the bill to implement the GST was before the committee. The Chairman, like the Chairman of the Ethics Committee, shut down debate and put the question. Liberal members argued at that time that the Chairman had no authority to disallow points of order, that the Chairman had no authority to disallow debate on what was clearly a debatable motion. The opposition in 1990 referred to an incident in 1984 when Claude-André Lachance, as Chairman of the Justice Committee, brought down the exact same decision as the Chairman of the Finance Committee did in 1990 and the Chairman of the Ethics Committee did yesterday. The circumstances were exact. In 1984, Mr. Lachance offered his resignation. In 1990, Mr. Bleckern, then chairman of the Finance Committee, did the same. I await the offer of resignation from the current chairman of the Ethics Committee. On March 21, 1990, John Rodriguez, an NDP member, said the following with respect to this matter. He said, and I quote, "The majority may not have liked the fact that we were waging a filibuster. They may not have liked that. But the fact was that we were not doing anything that was outside the parameters of the law. The law of the standing orders of the committees provide for that. We did not violate a law. We were simply conducting ourselves within the law." End of quote. The NDP could have taken the same ethical position on this issue today, but they chose not to. Instead, they're supporting the tyrannical actions of the chairman of the Ethics Committee yesterday. You, Mr. Speaker, were involved in that debate as well. On page 9603 of Hansard, you said that the chairman of the Finance Committee in 1990, quote, "had the honour to resign," unquote. Where is the honour today? The ethical standards of the opposition in this Parliament is well below grade, Mr. Speaker. While Speaker Fraser did not intervene in 1990, he did say, and I quote, "Committees are responsible for adhering to the normal procedural means and are expected not to behave in an arbitrary manner." End of quote. What is different in this Parliament is that you, Mr. Speaker, have determined that committees are already heading towards anarchy. And since your warning of March 14th, the Ethics Committee has ignored your warning. It tabled an illegal report that was ruled out of order. It is heading down the same path again and has also deployed behaviour that in 1990 and 1984 standards resulted in the chairman both times offering their resignations. In your March 14th ruling, you quoted Bourriaud and how he described the first principle of our parliamentary tradition as, quote, "to protect the minority and restrain the improvidence and tyranny of the majority, to secure the transaction of public business in a decent and orderly manner." What took place, Mr. Speaker, at the Ethics Committee yesterday was a clear case of the tyranny of the majority, trampling upon the rights of the minority. There are two sides to every story, Mr. Speaker, and the majority opposition have silenced one side. On April 14, 1987, Speaker Fraser said, and I quote, "It is essential to our democratic system that controversial issues should be debated at reasonable length so that every reasonable opportunity shall be available to hear the arguments, pro and con, and that reasonable delaying tactics should be permissible to enable opponents of a measure to enlist public support for their point of view." End of quote. It is essential to our democracy that both sides should be heard. Then it is essential that you, Mr. Speaker, intervene in this matter and prevent the Ethics Committee from conducting this one-sided partisan study until you have ruled. This is the only way that some protection can be afforded to innocent people whose reputation may get damaged in this process. They can't afford to wait for a report to come down before you intervene, Mr. Speaker, because by then the damage is done. The opposition on the Ethics Committee knows that its report will once again be ruled out of order, but that is not the point. Their objective is to tarnish reputations, hiding behind the immunity of parliamentary privilege. The majority opposition can't be allowed to abuse the rules to protect themselves and at the same time override those rules that protect the minority. Mr. Speaker, I ask for your assistance in this matter. Thank you.
The honourable member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-Lachine is rising on the same point.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, while I am not a member of the Standing Committee on Access and Ethics, I do know that the chair is not present today, and I would hope that before the Speaker would make a ruling on the point that has been raised by the government whip, the Speaker would afford the chair an opportunity to address the point that has been raised here, one. Secondly, in absence of a report, it might be the Speaker might feel it premature to issue a ruling, because one can only speculate as to what the report would deal with, and it's quite possible that the Speaker would deem, in fact, that the report is in order and may be received and properly tabled in the House. It's only the content of the report which would allow such a ruling. So I would ask the Speaker to allow the chair of the committee an opportunity to address this point of order. It is his ruling on the motion. The chair of that committee ruled the motion in order. It is that ruling which the government whip is contesting. So I would think that it's appropriate to allow the chair to address that issue here in the House. And secondly, as I said, the Speaker may feel it premature to make a ruling when there is no report before the House. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Saint-Bruno.
The honourable member for Saint-Bruno-Saint-Hubert on the same point of order. Yes, I'm a member of the Ethics Committee. I'm one of the rare members who was there during the 10 hours hearing the arguments put forward by the Conservative Party. We had 5 meetings on this issue. One meeting ended at 11 o'clock at night without any stopping. We had to remind the Conservative members that they were constantly repeating themselves, that their arguments were repetitive, that all that they were saying had already been said and then was no longer relevant because they tried to put forward several points but had nothing to do with the subject at hand. We were looking at the ethical practices of the Conservative members during the last election, which led to a search being conducted by Elections Canada and the RCMP. And the Conservative members made all kinds of allegations and accusations, but each time they were brought back to order, and the chair of the committee, who did wonderful work, he was extremely patient, Mr. Speaker. I know that you often have loud question periods here in the House, but I can tell you what we experienced in the Ethics Committee is nothing compared to Wednesday afternoon's questions period. So their members from the Conservative Party even were contemptuous of the chair to the extent that the chair asked one of their members, to apologize, which he refused to do, Mr. Speaker. So there was a lot of insulting, a lot of contempt. When there are no further arguments to be put forward, it was just chaos that ensued. So yesterday the chair, and I felt compelled to raise a point and saying, I went through all the list of arguments that had been established by the Conservative Party, the entire list that had been prepared, and that of the other parties. I went through the list, and at the start of yesterday's meetings, I said, here are the arguments that have been set forth. I did this because their members were coming in and replacing. That's fine. I have no problem with that, to have substitutes for the regular members. But they weren't aware of what had already been said. So you can understand that after 10 hours of debate, after 10 hours of haranguing, of contempt and of insults, you can understand that we had to make that a decision had to be made, and the chair made the right decision, a good decision. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, that you should let this committee pursue its work. And when we table the report here in the House, I would imagine that at that point you will be able to rule on the relevancy of the report, because we were focusing on the ethical practices of public office holders in the Conservative Party. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
On the same point of order, the honourable member for Joliette.
First of all, I think that the member for Saint-Bruno-Saint-Hubert expressed very well what went on in the Ethics Committee, but I will remind you of the Commons and Procedures and Practice, Marlo Mobati, there's a chapter which deals with order and decorum, and I would refer to an section that talks about repetition, and that the fact that the that the chair of the committee can bring on page 527. They talk about digression in the repetition and relevance of debate. The chair can limit debate. So the relevancy of remarks is an element that a chair of a committee can raise in making a decision, because all of the arguments had been exhausted. They had been repeated over and over again. In my opinion, the decision made by the chair of the Ethics Committee was a good one, and we would hope that in other committees that the chairs, particularly chairs from the government side, would read the provisions contained in the Rules of Order and Decorum, and the Committee on Justice and the Committee on House Affairs and Procedure, and a few months ago the Committee on Environment. I think we must not criticize the chairs of the Ethics Committee for making the decision made. I would also remind you, Mr. Speaker, that the committee, that the Rules of Order and Decorum had been respected, and that the whole issue, called the in and out file, has a direct tie to ethical questions. So it seems to me that the members of the committee should be able to rule on what the future work it will be pursuing is. And in this case, all the rules were respected. And I don't think that we should follow up on the point of order raised by the government House whip. I believe that this book on Rules of Order and Decorum was respected.
Member for Timmins, James Bay, on the same point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to say that I'm surprised that the Conservative House Leader has brought forward this pernicious motion today, but I'm actually not, because I think it speaks to one of the fundamental dysfunctions of what's happened in this Parliament. And I had sat on the House and Procedure Affairs Committee for a period, and I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that in my entire life I've never sat in a more malignant and toxic environment than what was allowed to happen at that committee, and under the Conservative chair from Cambridge, who was often unilateral in cutting off microphones, cutting off debates, interfering with members whenever it suited him. However, when it came to irrelevant filibustering, obstructionism, and a completely poisonous atmosphere by the Conservative members, he turned it into a mockery. And, Mr. Speaker, I think this is a very important issue here. What the Conservative Party is doing here is they've basically shut down all the areas of committees where we're doing necessary work, because they want to somehow control this Parliament from the blackberries and the war rooms of the PMO. We are parliamentarians. We have to protect the right of the committees and the members of Parliament to undertake investigations, regardless of whether the little pointy heads in the war room want to reduce it down to black and white, one syllable or one slogan issues. What we saw at House and Procedure Affairs, Mr. Speaker, was an absolute disgrace. Hour after hour, day after day, month after month of shutting down the work of Parliament, interfering with the work of Parliament, because, Mr. Speaker, this is a very important committee to deal with. So we have also the Ethics Committee, Mr. Speaker. The Ethics Committee plays an important role. And what are we examining? We were examining, or attempting to examine, at House and Procedure Affairs, the questions of potential illegalities of the Conservatives' election financing scheme, Mr. Speaker. That is an ethical issue. That is, of course, an ethical issue. It should have been and could have been debated at House and Procedure Affairs, and yet the Conservatives took that committee. They ran it into the ground. When the chair from Cambridge lost the confidence of the committee and they brought in the member for Elgin, Middlesex, London, he refused to sit as a chair, said he didn't know how to sit as a chair. Mr. Speaker, we're professionals here. We're here to do the legislative business of the country. So what we're seeing, Mr. Speaker, is an undermining of the fundamental confidence of Parliament. So I appeal to you at this point, Mr. Speaker, on the issue of allowing the Ethics Committee to do its work and not be undermined by the continual filibustering and game playing by a party that is now attempting to portray itself as somehow a wounded minority. Mr. Speaker, as the member said, that he said that there's a tradition of allowing reasonable length and allowing reasonable delaying tactics. Well, certainly, reasonable delaying tactics is a fundamental tool. But when you've seen an entire committee shut down for an entire parliamentary session, that does not meet the test of reasonableness by any standard of imagination. So now with the Ethics Committee, I think if you look at the record, Mr. Speaker, the chair acted properly. The chair is a well-respected chair, Mr. Speaker, and he clearly, if you look at the record, Mr. Speaker, you will see the poisonous, pathetic game playing that went on. So he had to make a ruling. He made the ruling, Mr. Speaker, not on partisan grounds, but on the fundamental issue of parliamentarians being able to do their work. And I think, Mr. Speaker, when you rule on this, as you most certainly will do in a very judicious manner, you will be cognizant of the fundamental issue here, Mr. Speaker. Is this, we've seen this pattern of obstructionism and contempt for Parliament, or a committee that's actually trying to do the work of Parliament? That is where the decision has to come down. And you will clearly see, if you look at the record from the Ethics Committee, Mr. Speaker, that the reasonable delaying lengths were allowed, the reasonable debate was allowed, even when it was extended into contempt and interference. That went for a fairly long period of time until the chair, who was and the Speaker, Mr. Speaker, you've always recognized that the committees are the masters of their own house. The chair had to make a ruling that it was time to move on. So I think at this point, Mr. Speaker, what we're seeing from the Conservatives is they're just trying to walk the clock down on this Parliament. They're trying to, again, throw more interference in the work of Parliament. And I appeal to you, Mr. Speaker, to basically throw this out. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Order. I'm reluctant to hear a lot more argument on this point because I have a question of privilege arising out of the same proceedings. Is this on the same point? Oh, my sainted aunt. All right. We'll go then to the honourable member for Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington next.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is on the same point. Just very briefly, there were a couple of incorrect statements made by the member from Timmins James Bay. He asserted incorrectly some comments with regard to the conduct of the member from Cambridge in his chairmanship of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and happily there is a Hansard which will demonstrate a reflection of the committee. Hansard will reflect and demonstrate that, in fact, his assertions about the arbitrary nature of the decisions made by that member when in the chair are actually simply incorrect. As well, I have to note that his suggestion that if there are problems on one committee, this justifies a suspension of the rules on another committee is clearly procedurally nonsense. It reminds me a bit of that ad where you see the football referee saying, well, you know, I made a wrong call against Team A, but don't worry, in the next half I'm going to make an equally egregious call against Team B and things will even themselves out. That's not how we work here, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do agree with something that the Liberal Deputy Whip said in her comments. She said that the chairman of the Ethics Committee is not here today and therefore cannot respond, and it would be inappropriate for you to rush to a decision today. And I think that there is some wisdom in that. It seems to me that it would be appropriate to take your time and make a decision in the appropriate manner, and it would be appropriate in particular to take your time and deal with this because we don't want to have a situation in which the chair of that committee makes further decisions that are abusive towards the rules by which we govern ourselves here and that put this institution into disrepute. Therefore, I think a decision as to whether the chair acted in a manner that is so egregious that he ought to resign is something that can very well wait until the House returns this autumn. However, I do think that you ought to take the preemptive measure of ensuring that the committee does not sit this summer and continue to engage potentially in abusive behavior unchecked and uncontrolled over an entire summer. And in saying this, I draw your attention to something that I think, unless it is simply untrue, but there's a answer that will demonstrate this, is clearly an abuse of his position, and that is in not allowing people on the members of Parliament on the Speaker's list to rise to speak, calling a question when other members have not yet been heard from. There's no excuse one can dream of. One can't say, look, the members were being repetitive. One can argue that an individual member can be cut off for being repetitive, even for repeating a point made by another member. But someone who is not yet on the Speaker's list, how can he know that unless he has some sort of telepathic power that the rest of us in this House are not bestowed with? It seems to me that that kind of abuse this summer would be a very, very dangerous thing. Mr. Speaker, I want to draw your attention to the fact that this matter, which has been before the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, which was the proper committee for it, as long ago as last August, has been the source of the acrimony and the partisanship and the poison, I think that's the word that was used by my colleague from Timmins James Bay, is the source of the problems. Not as he suggests, the moral inferiority of one of the parties in the House. And to allow a highly partisan subject to be discussed over the summer under the chairmanship of a chair who we are asserting has acted in a manner that is wildly outside the allowable role of a chairman is a very, very dangerous thing, Mr. Speaker. The fact that the member has absented himself and isn't here today is no reason why he therefore ought to be given free rein over the summer to do what he will in his role as chair on a highly partisan matter where every single vote in this matter, whether it was in this committee or in the previous committee, was taken entirely on partisan lines. Chairs were challenged regularly. Challenges were peremptory. An examination of the record procedure in House Affairs shows that speakers were regularly cut off, interrupted by each other, points were called on each other. In this kind of subject matter, it seems to me, over the summer, could do a lot of damage to the credibility of our institution. As well, Mr. Speaker, I draw your attention to the fact that as long ago as last September, I made an argument before the Committee on Procedure and House Affairs that in discussing this matter at all, we were violating the Sub Judice Convention, in which matters that are before the courts ought not to be dealt with in parliamentary committees because we are simply not set up to be effective institutions for making decisions as to the guilt or lack of guilt of any party in a court proceeding. And they can, in fact, make those court proceedings, they can taint those court proceedings. So to have a parliamentary committee under the chairmanship of someone who is clearly willing to violate the rules egregiously over an entire summer with no recourse to shutting it down or stopping it or limiting the damage that it can do in a matter that is before the courts that is highly partisan and very, very charged, it seems to me, is a recipe for the kind of disaster that would seriously put this institution into disrepute. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to draw to your attention a very important rule of this place. Committee chairs are given powers, but they are given no more power than the Speaker has in the House of Commons. We have had a chair who has asserted effectively that he has powers that exceed those of the Speaker of the House of Commons, who has asserted that it's okay for him to do things that are not permitted in this place. Now, if we, by allowing him to continue to carry on in this manner over an entire summer, as he engages in a court of Star Chamber, if we allow him to conduct himself in that way, we are setting the precedent that it is okay to do that, not only in other committees, but in this place. And I think we should all ask ourselves, do we really want to unilaterally rewrite the rules so that the minorities can be shut down, so that free speech can be cut off, so that dissent can be destroyed? Is that really what we want to do in this place? That's the reason why we do not want to have this committee sit this summer, why we want to ensure that you have the time to make your ruling so that the committee can conduct its business appropriately in the autumn after the House returns. Thank you.
I have a question for the honourable member for Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington. Has he any precedent for the Speaker shutting down a committee? I'm unaware of one. I'd be interested if he's got a precedent for that that would assist the chair in making a decision of that kind in the circumstances. Okay. The honourable member for Burnaby New Westminster.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this point of order on what was raised by the House Leader from the Conservative Party. Mr. Speaker, having lived through on the opposite side exactly what the House Leader is now complaining about today, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the precedent that you have set, given the guidelines in Marlow and Montpetit, and given the guidelines of parliamentary precedents, are very, very clear. Mr. Speaker, you have said that committees have the responsibility of maintaining their own decorum, that is something that is incumbent on the chair of the committee to do. And, Mr. Speaker, the Marlow and Montpetit and parliamentary precedents is very, very clear on that. When we look at page 827 of Marlow and Montpetit, it says very clearly that the chair is responsible for maintaining order in committee proceedings, Mr. Speaker. Very clear. A very clear precedence, a very clear mandate, Mr. Speaker. Then when we come to issues around speaking rights, well, Mr. Speaker, on parle de droit de parole.
When you look at the French version, 857, it says that committee members must be given the floor by the chair before they take the floor, and occasionally, Mr. Speaker, the committee may strictly limit the amount of time spent on a given issue. Mr. Speaker, it's very clear in Marlow and Montpetit. Now we have to look at precedents.
Been a long-time member of the Standing Committee of International Trade. You are aware, as I am, of what transpired in the fall of 2005, essentially, 2006. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. In 2006, Chair of the Standing Committee on International Trade simply stopped allowing the interventions of the NDP to revise and take out the most egregious aspects of the softwood lumber agreement. Now, Mr. Speaker, that was done. The chair, working with members of the committee, simply agreed to stop, first limit the interventions that we could make on the many amendments we brought to that most egregious agreement, something that has cost 10,000 jobs, but that's not relevant to this point of order, Mr. Speaker. But we brought forward 100 amendments, and the committee chair, with the majority of the committee, then decided to limit speaking time to 3 minutes on any one of those amendments, Mr. Speaker. Later on, the same committee chair, Conservative committee chair, working with the support of other opposition parties in that committee, limited the time of debate to 1 minute, Mr. Speaker. Further on these same amendments designed to stop the almost certain hemorrhaging of jobs that we foresaw through the softwood lumber agreement, was limited to 30 seconds, Mr. Speaker. And then finally, the committee chair, Conservative committee chair, said there would be no debate. There would be no debate on amendments, no debate on the actual implications of each and every clause by clause of the softwood lumber agreement, and the amendments to the softwood lumber agreement were adopted, Mr. Speaker, with no debate, not 1 second of debate, no points allowed, no opportunity to actually raise the concerns that were there, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, as you are well aware, having gone through that process where Conservatives decided that an agreement and a bill that had substantial and profound consequences for people in softwood communities from coast to coast to coast, from northern Quebec to northern Ontario, northern Manitoba, northern Saskatchewan, northern Alberta, throughout British Columbia, the Conservative chair decided there would be no debate whatsoever, Mr. Speaker. So the precedence was, as you well are aware, I brought forward, and the NDP caucus brought forward concerns that we were adopting legislation that had not been vetted appropriately, where there hadn't been discussion over the clauses of the bill, and no discussion whatsoever on the amendments that would actually make a difference and save jobs. No witnesses were called, Mr. Speaker, at that point to actually talk about the various aspects of this particular bill. So, Mr. Speaker, in the precedents there was very clear. We brought this forward to you. We raised our concerns, and you, referring back to Marleau and Montpetit, and obviously, I believe, Mr. Speaker, you have been consistent in your rulings, and in this case there is very clear consistency in this previous ruling. You ruled that the committee chair was right to do that the committee as a whole had the ability to not only curtail debate, but eliminate debate. That a majority of the committee could simply say, no, there will be no debate whatsoever. Now, Mr. Speaker, we come back to this issue because in this committee case, there's very clearly, and we had comment from the representative, the member from the Bloc Québécois, who participated in the Ethics Committee, where there was profound debate, widespread debate, ongoing debate, Mr. Speaker. Debate that continued on and on and on, and then finally the chair of that committee, having faced countless points of order, we're not talking about substantial interventions like the NDP offered on the softwood lumber sell-out, where there were real amendments that would have made a difference in changing the agreement and stopping the hemorrhaging of jobs. We're talking about, from the transcripts, spurious points of debate that were raised. Spurious points of debate that were raised, and yet, Mr. Speaker, for the Conservatives now to say that the committee majority of other parties and the committee chair were doing something that was untoward when they have practiced it themselves consistently, Mr. Speaker, well, it simply defies imagination. Now, finally, Mr. Speaker, I do want to raise, because I know we will be moving forward on Bill C-5, and we've got debate time allocated to that this morning. I think it is important to point out that the House Leader is one of the people who may be brought forward to the Ethics Committee. So for him to raise it as a point of order, I think is inappropriate. If the Ethics Committee is seeking to examine those individuals and riding associations that have been tied with the In-N-Out scandal and seeking to follow up on Elections Canada's concerns, very legitimate concerns that were raised around certain ridings and certain candidates. They are all Conservatives, Mr. Speaker. Elections Canada is not in the process of looking at other candidates, but they certainly do that on an ongoing basis, Mr. Speaker, and it seems to me inappropriate that members of this House who may be called before the Ethics Committee are now trying to essentially beseech you to not have the Ethics Committee call those members before to testify on their involvement in the In-N-Out scandal. Well, Mr. Speaker, those are the points I wanted to raise in addition to those that have been raised by my colleague from James Bay.
Good job. The honourable member for Edmonton Leduc.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I feel compelled to add some comments on this point of order for certainly a reason that I did observe some of the goings-on at the Ethics Committee, but also, secondly, I want to add my perspective of a chair of the Industry, Science and Technology Committee, committee which I feel is functioning very well, Mr. Speaker. First of all, Mr. Speaker, committees, it's said that they are masters of themselves, and I certainly know that as the chair, but chairs must follow the rules of Parliament. I, as the chair of the Industry Committee, cannot arbitrarily determine things. I have to follow a set of rules. I have a clerk, a very capable clerk, who advises me as to what those rules are, procedurally, whether motions are in order or not. And in my view, what's happened in this situation is the fact that the rules were not followed. The fundamental right of members of Parliament to speak, the fundamental right of freedom of speech, was not followed in this instance. I refer the Speaker to page 71 of Marleau and Montpetit, which states, "By far the most important right accorded to members of the House is the exercise of freedom of speech in parliamentary proceedings." Now, Mr. Speaker, as you know, this House and committees can allocate time to the length of speeches, but that was not done in this case. There was no such motion put forward and passed at that committee which allocated time with respect to the amount of time that members could speak. And as the member for Lanark-Carleton pointed out, the fact of the matter is, when you call relevance on a speaker, you have to actually hear the speaker before you can call relevance on them. You have to actually hear from them before you call relevance on them. Mr. Speaker, a chair must recognize a member to speak, and I want to refer, especially for members of the Bloc Québécois, there was a bill before our committee in the last before the prorogation, Bill C-47, where 3 of the parties wanted the bill passed very quickly. One party, the Bloc Québécois, did not want the bill passed very quickly. Now, I had 3 parties saying to me quite loudly, cut the member off, get to the point, we want to pass this bill, but I did not. Even though I do not share the same party as that member, I allowed the member to speak because it was his right to do so. It was a fundamental right of free speech to speak on that issue. He was filibustering, but that was his right, and I, as a chair, recognized that right. I checked with the clerk, provided by the House of Commons, a partial clerk, and he said he has the right to speak. You may not like it as a chair, other members may not like it, other parties may not like it. And that's what members, especially in a minority government situation, should realize. There will always be different dynamics at committee. Sometimes it will be the Bloc that will want the right to speak. Sometimes it will be the Liberals, sometimes the Conservatives, sometimes the NDP, which is why you have rules, Mr. Speaker, and that's what was not followed in this case. A chair must recognize a member, and a chair cannot cut off debate unless it has been provided for by a vote, a closure vote or something in this House of Commons or at committee, and it was not provided in this case. And the third point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, very strongly is that committees, as we know, and I would again say, I mean, the industry committee, and I thank all members, they work very well in that committee. Other committees are working well. But the fact of the matter is, there is, and it pains me to say this, there are a number of committees that have become dysfunctional. Mr. Speaker, you took a very strong step in this place of standing in this place as our Speaker and admonishing us and saying that the rules at committee must be followed, that chairs cannot step outside those rules. They do not have authority to do so. You were right to stand in this place and do so. Mr. Speaker, I implore you to rule on this point of order and find in favor of the Chief Government Whip, because if we do not do so, my fear is more and more committees will become dysfunctional. More and more committees will look at unsubstantive things. And I hear members across laughing. Well, I would just put it, the members of the Bloc Québécois can talk to the members on the Industry, Science and Technology Committee about how we can focus on substantive issues. But the fact is, Mr. Speaker, if we get away from substantive issues and if we allow chairs to unilaterally make decisions that are not in accordance with the rules of this place, the fact is we will have more dysfunctional committees and we'll have a more dysfunctional parliament, and that is not what any of us should want in this place.
Hear, hear. The honourable member for Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox and Addington is rising to answer a question I asked.
That's right, Mr. Speaker. You had asked a question at the end of my remarks. I'm concerned that you may have misunderstood what I'm asking you to do, or perhaps that I had expressed myself poorly and therefore had been created a situation where misunderstanding could occur. I'm not asking you to shut down the committee, Mr. Speaker, which I think was what you were understanding that I would say. I'm actually not asking you to make an immediate ruling, given the difficulties that are involved, including the fact that the chair of the Ethics Committee is not here to present his case, which does, of course, deserve to be presented. I have my own feelings on whether he broke the rules or not, but that is separate from the point I was trying to make. What I am asking you to do is to, without finding any on either side of the question of order, to accept that the disorder that you referred to earlier in March when you talked about committees were approaching chaos, to recognize that this potentially has occurred, that effectively this committee may be operating in disorder. And what is appropriate for a chair to do when a committee is in disorder is to cause the committee meeting to be suspended until it can be reconvened in good order. The assertion that I've been making is that effectively this committee, by meeting this summer, may continue to operate effectively in disorder, engaging in a tyranny of the majority, in what amounts to chaos because the rules are being suspended whenever they don't suit the will of the majority, and that this is why I used the phrase "quarter star chamber." So what I would like you to do is to simply suspend the committee for the summer and then make a ruling this autumn. And if you find that the committee has been operating in good order and that the chairman's rulings were in fact reasonable and appropriate, then the committee could carry on. There is far less damage to be caused by holding off on those hearings until the autumn than there is in allowing them to go forward if the hypothesis that I've been presenting and that others have been presenting, that the chairman is operating outside the rules and ignoring the rules is in fact the case. I want to point out this very important point, Mr. Speaker, with regard to setting precedents. I should point out that if you allow the committee to continue to operate, if you do not suspend it, I think you actually are setting a precedent, and you're setting the following precedent, which is that it is acceptable for a committee to, on the very last day of Parliament, which is what happened here, the very last sitting day of Parliament, to rush through a decision which is an abuse of the rules, even a grotesque and obvious abuse of the rules, and by ensuring that at least one or two of the players who were involved and not present to comment, effectively make it impossible for you or any future speaker to make a ruling, thereby allowing them to have a whole summer free to ignore all the rules of Parliament and to engage in potentially grotesque abuses. I do anticipate, Mr. Speaker, if you do not suspend the committee, that we can anticipate the current chair will carry on in a manner that I regard as being a grotesque abuse of the rules, and will in fact ensure that by the time we come back, the Conservative Party has been found guilty by the committee of all the allegations that have been made. That's the danger, that's the precedent that could be set, and therefore I simply point out that you're really in a situation where you can't avoid making a precedent. This seems to be the more dangerous precedent. The safer precedent would be establishing the precedent that when something happens at the last minute, and as is at least possible, done in a coordinated fashion to ensure that no full ruling can be made, that therefore the door is open to whatever abuses might occur. The only avenue I could see for governments in the future to deal with this sort of thing would be to prorogue every summer at the end of when the House sits, as a way of ensuring that any minority government, as a way of ensuring that these abuses do not occur, because effectively the precedent will have been set where, even if that's not what's happening here today or happening yesterday, that effectively is what will be permitted in the future. I think that is a very, very dangerous precedent to set. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Chair is prepared to rule on this matter. I've heard plenty of arguments, and I'm quite prepared to make a ruling and deal with this issue at this moment. Unfortunately, the member for Frontenac, Lanark, Frontenac, Lennox didn't come up with any precedents where speakers had made the ruling he's asking me to make in suspending this committee from operation until a ruling is made on the point of order. But I'm having no difficulty making a ruling on the point of order today, and I stress that the past practice in this regard is, in my view, quite clear. And I'll read from Marlon Mopetit at page 804. Committees, as creations of the House of Commons, only possess the authority, structure, and mandates that have been delegated to them by the House. These are found in the standing and special orders which the House has adopted concerning committees. The House has specified that in relationship to standing, special, or legislative committees, quote, the standing order shall apply so far as may be applicable, except the standing orders as to the election of a speaker, seconding of motions, limiting the number of times of speaking and length of speeches, end of quote. With these exceptions, committees are bound to follow the procedures set out in the standing orders, as well as any specific sessional or special orders that the House has issued to them. The committees are otherwise left free to organize their work. In this sense, committees are said to be masters of their own proceedings. What we have in this case is a situation where the Speaker of the committee made a decision which I understand was appealed to the committee, and the majority of the committee upheld the Speaker's ruling. Alors, cette enquête, the chair.
So it's a decision that was made by the committee acting as a group, and if I have an opinion concerning the committee's decision, I can do nothing until the decision has been sent to the House in a report. It's only at that time that the chair can do something in relation to a committee. There are no other precedents on this.
Committees have to meet or not meet. I have no power to direct a committee to do something until their report is come here and I make a ruling on the report. And I have done one. The Chief Government Whip in his argument pointed out that on a report that came here, I ruled the report out of order, and that a motion to concur in the report would be out of order, and chucked it. And I can do that if the committee brings in a report. But it hasn't. And so members are asking me to decide that the decision of the chair of the committee, or alternatively the decision of the committee itself, because there was a vote in the committee, is somehow improper, and that therefore I can overrule it or stop it from proceeding. And I don't believe that I have that power. And indeed, no speaker previously, and any precedent that's been quoted to me, has exercised that kind of power. And accordingly, I don't believe this is a question of privilege, a point of order. I don't believe it's well-founded. I believe that it's something that has to be resolved in the committee. Committees are masters of their own procedure. They can proceed as they wish within limits. It's when they come back to the House that they run into trouble. Now, I point out for the benefit of honourable members, in the old days, prorogation was a standard feature at the end of a session in June, and the House would start a new session in the autumn. That used to be the case all the time until the 70s, and that was kind of abandoned. Second, in the old days, committees couldn't sit when the House wasn't sitting. They were only allowed to sit when the House was sitting. And honourable members, I'm sure, are familiar with the rules of the Senate, which are perhaps a little older than ours in this sense, where if the Senate is adjourned for more than a week, a committee needs the consent of the Senate in advance in order to sit during that week. And a whole bunch of motions were passed in the Senate the other day permitting sittings of committees between now and next Thursday when the Senate's sitting again because it adjourned for more than a week. Members can change the rules of the House and make it impossible for the House committees to sit when we're adjourned if they want to. But we expanded the powers of committees years ago significantly, and it's not for the chair, the Speaker, in my view, to sit here and decide what powers committees have quand la Chambre elle-même.
The House itself decided to give all types of powers to committees, perhaps not during this Parliament, but this was decided upon during previous parliaments, perhaps when members decided that they wanted to do something else. Now we have standing orders that are adopted by the House, and the Speaker has to enforce those standing orders. The standing orders exist, and there's nothing available to me at this time that would allow me to deal with this committee because there's nothing here that I can use to render a decision.
Edmonton Sherwood Park has a question of privilege, and the chair has received notice of that, and it arises out of the same committee proceeding. So I'll hear his question of privilege now.
Mr. Speaker, may I have your leave to do a point of order just before I start my privilege? Thank you. I just would like clarification based on your ruling that you just made. Is it then now going to be acceptable for a committee to, within its own power, to establish its own mandate, its own terms of reference? I was of the opinion, Mr. Speaker, that that was done by the House of Commons and that the individual committees do not have this power. And it seems to me that your ruling might bring us to that. So I'd like clarification on that.
The standing orders don't give the Speaker any powers to decide what a committee's mandate is. The standing orders state what they are. When the chair is able to decide something, it's when the report comes here. If the report is beyond the scope of the committee, it's out. And I've done that. But the standing orders do not say that the Speaker has a supervisory power over committees to decide whether rulings by chairs in relation to the jurisdiction of the committee or any other aspect of a committee's work are appealable to the chair. It's not permitted. And so, in my view, we're stuck. The committee can file a report. If the report is beyond the committee's scope, beyond its powers, then as Speaker, I can refuse a motion to concur in the report and send the report back to the committee, which is exactly what I've done once already. Now, the honourable member's question of privilege. We'll hear that.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As you know, I've been around here as long as some of the older members. In fact, Mr. Speaker, of all of the members of Parliament, I have some pride in stating that there are only now 4 members of Parliament who are older than I am, though some have been here longer, because they started much younger than I. In all my years here, I have gained a bit of a reputation, Mr. Speaker, of being a substitute. I often go into different committees for different people. And so I've observed many different committees working over the years. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I'm so frequently at other committees that I got a permanent nameplate made for myself so they don't have to handwrite one. So I've seen different chairs operating over the years, and it has been a real privilege to observe that over the years. But, Mr. Speaker, occasionally we see things that don't seem quite up to par. I remember, Mr. Speaker, in an earlier Parliament, where a chair obviously breached a fundamental rule of democracy. And that was on an occasion about 10 or 12 years ago, where the chair, when we were going through a bill, point by point, you know, the clause by clause, he said, shall clause, whatever the number was, pass. Nobody said anything except me. I said no. He said carried. And so I raised a point of privilege in the House here, or a point of order, and I pointed that out. Because chairs, Mr. Speaker, of committees are not infallible. And when it comes to something like that, I think that they have to be challenged. And so I did that, and there again you said the committee was a master of its own fate, and that's fine. But that's a fundamental violation of democracy. Well, I have another one here, Mr. Speaker, that happened last Tuesday, when I was, as usual, substituting in this committee for one of my members who had other duties. And when I was in the seat there as a substitute, I allowed the regular members of the committee to carry the debate, because I'm not one who usually intrudes myself into other people's work. I was there to help and to serve. I put my name on the speaker's list, but I dutifully waited my turn. Now, observing the way the committee meeting was going, I saw the chair over and over again cut off the mic. He turned around in his chair to signal the switcher that said, turn off his mic. And so my colleagues were busily making points with respect to the issue that was being debated. And when the chair, and I'll say this gently, Mr. Speaker, when he heard things that he didn't like, he cut them off. It wasn't that they were out of order or that they were repeating, but he cut them off. And so, Mr. Speaker, I think that it's important for you to hear my first intervention, and I'm going to read this into the record in the House of Commons, Mr. Speaker, even though it's on the committee, because he finally gave me the floor, and then I
Order. I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut the honourable member off because it's 11 o'clock and we have to move on with other business. However, I will hear him after question period, and he'll be able to complete his question of privilege then. But at the moment, we have to move under the standing orders to statements by members, and I call upon the honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, my Conservative Party colleagues on the Standing Committee for International Trade respectfully dissent from the report Human Rights and the Environment and Free Trade with Colombia. It is clear that this report does not accurately reflect the views of all the members of this committee, nor does it reflect the testimony of the majority of the witnesses who appeared before the committee. It is our opinion that a Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement will both expand Canada-Colombia trade and investment and will help ongoing efforts by the Government of Colombia to create a prosperous, equitable, and secure democracy. Our government's commitment to deepening its engagement in the Americas seeks to promote increased prosperity, greater security, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Furthermore, the Conservative members of the committee believes these objectives are interrelated and mutually reinforcing, and that is why we cannot align ourselves with the recommendations expressed in this report. Mr. Speaker, we believe that this report lacks balance, as the opposition members played partisan politics to
the honourable member for Thunder Bay, Rainy River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I was in university earning my graduate degree in environmental studies, the future of our planet seemed mighty grim. Eagles were disappearing and rivers didn't freeze in the winter because they were so contaminated with mercury. Since that graduation, I've been working on many, many environmental causes, as a councillor, as a mayor, and as a member of Parliament. But yesterday, it all came together. The Green Shift is a plan that gives us all hope for the future. Since yesterday's announcement, people have been calling with excited and encouraging words. For me, it is with a dynamic sense of optimism that I can tell my constituents that we have a plan that will work, that we have a plan that will help, that we have a plan that will bring a richer, greener, and fairer Canada, and will restore that sense of democracy and optimism in our country. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges. Mr. Speaker, Refugee assistance organizations such as the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the Canadian Commission for UNESCO are meeting today to celebrate World Refugee Day with the theme Protecting Refugees, Rebuilding Lives in Safety and Dignity. This day is an opportunity to pay tribute to the strength, courage, and incredible determination of refugees throughout their difficult journey. They have been uprooted, and they've gone from oppression and persecution to asylum and protection to finally find a place they can call home. This will also be an opportunity to recognize the efforts of those people who have helped them as they rebuild their lives in safety and dignity. My colleagues from the Bloc Québécois and myself salute the efforts of the organizations who have helped refugees rebuild their lives in safety and dignity. We need to take concrete measures to protect refugees, and our bill is designed to protect refugees. This bill put forward by the member of Laval will do much to help refugees. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Liberals announced their carbon tax plan, which can only be characterized as a won't-get-it-done plan. As the British Columbia Minister of Environment said, they really are not taking the bull by the horns. Or as Dave Martin from Greenpeace said, in our view, the Dion plan really doesn't go far enough. There are many things wrong with this plan that it's hard to know where to start, but here's two. First, it has absolutely no targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't even mention Kyoto. Secondly, there are no measures to encourage Canadians to embrace renewable energy. All this plan does is make Canadians, especially Northerners and rural people, pay more while large corporations continue business as usual. This summer, the NDP will be consulting with Canadians on how to best move forward with renewable energy. After listening to this, we will be putting forward a plan which will move Canada quickly towards a more renewable energy future, provide energy security, create new green-collar jobs, and combined with our cap-and-trade plan, take real action to...
The honourable member for Northumberland, Quinte West.
Mr. Speaker, after finally getting the details of the Liberals' carbon tax grab, my constituents are very concerned. Regardless of the Liberal leader's claim that his plan is revenue neutral, it's plain to see that this is impossible. The reason for this tax shaft is that the Liberal leader needed to find a way to pay for all his unbudgeted spending promises, and he's doing it on the backs of the Canadian taxpayer. He plans to spend all the money it brings in on programs, on special interests, on endless priorities. Canadians will feel the effects of this tax grab directly and indirectly. You cannot drive up the cost of transporting gas, groceries, and everything else without hurting consumers. You cannot prevent manufacturers, once taxed, from passing their losses on to their customers. The only green shift that would occur is the shifting of money out of Canadians' wallets.
Honourable member for Davenport.
Mr. Speaker, when the previous Liberal government implemented its new deals for the cities, municipal governments across Canada found a seat at the national table. Cities like Toronto, home to millions of Canadians, finally found a partner in the federal government. In contrast, the Conservative government policy can be summed up in one statement: no deals for cities, leaving Toronto and other cities to fend for themselves. The facts are alarming, Mr. Speaker. $123 billion is needed for infrastructure work. Soaring demands are being placed upon municipal public transit system, and the economic prosperity of our urban centre is being threatened. This government must start responding to the needs of Canadian cities. Cities like Toronto deserve to be treated with respect, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Crowfoot.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents will not be deceived by the Liberals' carbon tax. We know that the Liberal leader's plan is to impose a permanent new tax that would hurt all Canadians. On farms across our country, fertilizer prices are already costly and will be more expensive if the Liberals get to launch their new tax grab. There are sin taxes already on alcohol and tobacco, and now the Liberals want to apply a sin tax on rural and urban Canadians who are heating their homes in the winter and driving to work year-round. They want to tax electricity, even if it kills manufacturing jobs, and hit seniors and everyone else on a fixed income. The Liberals are promising to almost triple the tax on diesel. This will also hurt farmers and increase the cost of everything transported by truck or train, including food. My constituents know that every carbon tax imposed in Europe has hit gas prices hard, very hard. The Liberal carbon tax plan would be a dirty trick and would hurt all Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Lefjord. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government has not fulfilled its promise to set up an expeditionary squadron at the Bagotville base, despite the announcement made there back in July 2007 by the Minister of Defence at that time. Due to the lack of headway in this project, I recently tabled a brief with the Conférence Régionale des Élus de Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. I was recommending to elected officials in the regions to mobilize to ensure that the Conservatives respect their promise and do everything that is necessary to ensure that new military soldiers come into this region as quickly as possible. The Conservatives must respect the promise that they made to the people of Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. The people of Chicoutimi-Lefjord will not accept any compromise on the Conservatives' commitment. Mr. Speaker, I would tell this government, if you make a promise, you have to keep it.
The member for Prince Edward Hastings.
Speaker, yesterday in the Chronicle Herald, the Liberal member from Cape Breton-Canso suggested that he too is worried about the massive Liberal tax hike. I quote, "When you cross the street and get hit by a car, it doesn't matter if you're in the crosswalk, you're still dead. If we don't get this right politically, we'll pay," he said. End of quote. Well, how prophetic for the Liberal Party. But while the Liberal members are worrying about their jobs and electoral prospects, Canadians are worried about paying for heating their homes, getting to work, and putting food in their children's mouths. This deceitful tax grab is supposed to be revenue neutral, but in fact it bleeds income from students, families, small business, and puts it in the grips of the Liberal Party. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to be fooled. The Conservative members will not be fooled. The good people of Prince Edward Hastings will not be fooled. And all Canadians will not be fooled. They know when they're getting the shaft and not the shift.
The Honourable Member for London North Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in recognition of World Refugee Day, held annually on June 20th. It is a day to recognize the hardships that the world's refugee population faces, especially those who live without material, social, or legal protection. It is also a day to celebrate the tireless efforts of all those striving to protect and improve the lives of forcibly displaced people, from the provision of food and shelter to support for those lacking legal status or helping those who wish to return to their home country. This year, World Refugee Day focuses on the fundamental need for protection. For some, protection means economic security. For others, this means freedom from violence, persecution, or even death. Mr. Speaker, I ask my colleagues in this House and all Canadians to help protect refugees by raising awareness at the grassroots level in local communities, workplaces, and online. By forming a global network of supporters, we help ensure that protection is extended equally around the world and that the plight of refugees is in some small way improved. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A Liberal dirty tax trick by any other name, say a green shift, is still a Liberal dirty tax trick. The Liberal leader gleefully announced he'll permanently up the cost of gas, electricity, and everything Canadians buy, killing Canadian jobs. Now, peel back the green veneer, and this permanent new Liberal tax isn't about the environment. 40-plus pages about the crushing tax, not a single word about how many GHGs this green shaft will reduce. Now, polluting industries won't pay. They'll pass on the tax to consumers. But truckers and farmers will pay. Canadians will pay on everything, including ultimately the price of gas. In fact, the only green shift that will occur with this Liberal tax is hard-earned money from Canadians' wallets to the Liberal leaders' coffers. The Liberals once promised to kill the GST. Now they're adding a tax as large as the GST permanently on virtually everything you buy, so the Liberal leader can spend it all on programs, on special interests, and endless priorities. Under this punitive tax, the Liberal leader gets the green gold mine. Canadians and the environment get the shaft.
The Honourable Member for Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the people of Northern Ontario will certainly take a massive hit from the Liberal carbon tax plan, because the tax on home heating fuels will affect rural residents, seniors, and they will be treated the same as though that they were the Athabasca tar sands. There's nothing in this plan to deal with massive pollution, and yet I dealt with the families in Northern Ontario, the seniors who were paying crippling heating bills last year, and there is nothing in this plan to help them shift to a more alternative fuels, Mr. Speaker. When we're talking about a green shift, this is really a blame shift. This is taking the blame away from the big polluters and putting it onto the people who can't afford to pay. So, Mr. Speaker, what we're dealing with here is no plan from the Conservatives. a bad plan from the Liberals, or the plan that was actually seen as becoming the model, which is the plan supported by the New Democratic Party, the cap-and-trade system, Mr. Speaker. This is where they're going in Europe. This is being supported in the U.S. And unlike my Conservative colleagues, I don't attack the Liberals and believe that the Liberal leader has nefarious motions. I just think he doesn't get it.
The honourable member for Mississauga, Brampton South.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Leader of the Opposition launched a new debate. It's a debate about building a richer, greener and fairer Canada. The Liberal Party believes that it is time that we put a price on pollution and put every single penny back into the hands of Canadians. Polluters will pay and Canadians will gain. It's called the Green Shift, Mr. Speaker, and it's a good idea. It's a bold idea, and Canadians are ready for this debate. The Conservatives have done nothing for more than 2 years. They have no plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and no plan for the 21st century economy. Instead of engaging Canadians honestly, all this government can do is call us names, mislead Canadians, and use throwaway cute phrases. Mr. Speaker, the time has come to do what is right, not what is easy, for our environment and for our future. We will fight fear with hope, we will fight lies with facts, and we'll build a richer, greener, and fairer Canada.
The honourable member for Châteauguay, Saint-Constant. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow, June 21st, is National Aboriginal Day, the theme being the encounter between Aboriginals and Europeans. In mutual respect, the Bloc Québécois advocates an approach of nation to nation. The federal government recently apologized to the victims of the federal residential schools. Mem in Kanawaki, in my writing, young Mohawk people have suffered from irreparable damage. Ellen Gabriel, president of the Femmes Autochtones du Québec, has been calling for more efforts to be made to remedy the oppressive measures preventing Aboriginal peoples to prosper socially, culturally, politically, and economically. If the Conservatives are serious about their apologies, I would invite the Prime Minister to wait no more and to support the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Aboriginal People in order to demonstrate that his apologies are not futile. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the Treasury Board is an embarrassment to his Conservative colleagues. His golden parachute eases him into a well-paying job as a judge in Manitoba, but alas, he has not finished and embarrassing them yet. In 2004, he complained about how much money judges were paid in this country, and I quote, "Despite the fact that there are at least 10 qualified candidates for every position, the minister says he must boost the pay of judges." Where are the 10 qualified applicants for each judicial position? I wonder if the Minister of Justice will tell us the names of the 10 qualified applicants that are being passed over in favor of the President of the Treasury Board.
Yeah.
His soon-to-be honor once was quoted as saying, "I would not see the politicization of the process where judges run for office." I am glad politics are being kept out of this appointment, Mr. Speaker. The President of the Treasury Board may soon go from the Conservative benches to the federal bench. But for this government and its colleagues, the embarrassment continues.
The honourable member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned. Yesterday, the leader of the Liberal Party outlined his carbon tax plan. This plan would impose financial hardship on farmers and other rural Canadians. Farmers can't take the bus, Mr. Speaker, and the last time I looked, there was no subway under the cornfields of Elgin County. The only way to heat their homes in much of rural Canada is by heating oil or electricity. Should farmers be encouraged to huddle together and think green thoughts this winter to keep warm? Our farmers are asking, will they be forced to take the hard-earned green from their fields and hand it over for huge spending promises? Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the leader of the Liberal Party would like farmers to carpool to their fields in the morning. I wonder how we would ever think that his rural green credit would make this plan okay with rural Canadians. $150 a year. I know that John Deere is green, but on 41 cents a day, I'm not sure they'll be able to start the tractor.
Order. Oral questions. Questions orales. The honourable member for Ottawa South.
Mr. Speaker, since Conservatives came to power in January of 2006, energy prices have skyrocketed. A litre of gas at the pump is 45% higher.
A litre of diesel is 50% higher. Home heating oil is 72% higher. The Liberal Green Shift Plan will help Canadians to adjust to these new prices by offering billions of dollars in income tax cuts and other benefits. We're shifting taxes off of income and innovation and onto pollution and helping Canadians. How does the Prime Minister intend to help Canadians offset these massive increases in energy costs incurred on his watch?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
The way we're going to help Canadians cope with avoiding massive increases in energy costs is by ensuring that the Liberal Party doesn't get elected with their carbon tax plan. You know, the Liberal leader told his party when he was seeking the leadership, elect me and I won't give you a carbon tax. He told them that, he tricked them, and then he gave them the green shaft yesterday. There they are, saddled with the carbon tax they never wanted. But you know what? That flip-flop is so dramatic that they haven't caught up. On the Liberal website today, it still says, we do not favour a carbon tax. Well, I wish they'd make up their minds.
The Honourable Member for Ottawa South.
Mr. Speaker, we have a plan to help Canadians reduce their reliance on fossil fuels, and in exchange, to compensate to offset the increase in energy prices. The Prime Minister says that countries like Norway, Sweden, Germany, the UK, Denmark, Italy, and the Netherlands are models of crazy countries because they have carbon taxes. Does the Prime Minister really believe that these European countries are wrong? Crazy? The Honourable Government House Leader. The Liberal leader promised his party that he would never introduce a carbon tax. But yesterday, we saw something else. He changed his mind. I will quote the Liberal leader last fall when he said, there will be no carbon tax. Obviously, when the Liberal leader says something, you can't believe it. The Honourable Member for Ottawa South.
Is on to compete in the carbon-constrained 21st century. And instead of leading, this Prime Minister has no interest in seeing Canada become the greenest and cleanest economy in the world. I'll tell you what's truly crazy, Mr. Speaker. What's crazy is a Prime Minister who won't act now to help ensure future generations have a sustainable atmosphere. What's crazy is a Prime Minister who's shutting Canada out of what Goldman Sachs describes as a $3 trillion environmental technologies market. Why doesn't the Prime Minister understand that environmental leadership is economic leadership?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, in the tax plan the Liberal leader released yesterday, a tax plan he said he would never have, in that tax plan he doesn't mention 1 single ounce of reduction in greenhouse gases. So they can hide behind that all they want. All it is a tax plan. And you know what else they said in it? They say there wouldn't be any taxes on gasoline in it. But what did the Liberal finance critics say yesterday? The member from Markham Unionville acknowledges that a full carbon tax would be devilishly complicated. A Liberal government might begin with something a great deal more straightforward, such as a tax on imported oil. Guess what that means? Higher gasoline prices in Ontario, in Quebec, in all the Atlantic provinces. Guess what? They've already changed their mind in one day on that part of the policy.
The Honourable Member for York West.
Mr. Speaker, in reference to our Green Plan, the University of Calgary economics professor Jack Mintz said, and I quote, I don't think this plan will be negative on growth. In fact, it will most probably be quite positive. Now, given the fact that the Prime Minister has a master's in economics from Professor Mintz's own department, does the Prime Minister also think that Professor Mintz is crazy?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, all I know is that Jack Mintz went on television last night to say, I had nothing to do with the construction of the Liberal plan. Apparently he's so embarrassed about a plan that says absolutely nothing about reducing greenhouse gases, a plan that the Liberal leader promised he would never, ever implement. Elect me leader. I'll never give you a carbon tax. A few months later, guess what? They've got a carbon tax. That's why Canadians don't trust this tax trick. It's nothing but one great big tax grab from the Liberal leader.
The Honourable Member for York West.
There's more fear-mongering. Keep it up. Mr. Speaker, Doug Porter, Deputy Chief Economist of BMO Capital Market, believes that carbon taxes are, and I quote, about as efficient a way as there is out there to battle climate change. Now, economists know that when you cut taxes on income and investment, you get more jobs and increased productivity. That's our green plan. So when you tax pollution, polluters will find cleaner ways to dispose of their waste. What's so crazy about that?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I will say this much for the Liberal Party. It's refreshing to see them finally, after a year of debating anything else but policy ideas and issues, to finally raise an issue. Unfortunately, it's an issue on which no Canadian believes them because their leader said he would never do it. He said it last fall. There will never be a carbon tax. He said it during the leadership campaign. It was a bad policy. And guess what he said yesterday? I love my carbon tax policy. I love higher taxes. But he didn't say one word about one figure, about 1 ounce of reduction in greenhouse gases. It's nothing but a carbon tax trick, and Canadians know that.
The Honourable Member for Honourable Joliette.
We found out that the former Foreign Affairs Minister is going to give an explanation in the Beauce next week. He heard that the House of Commons would be adjourning for the summer. Wasn't that brave of him? Doesn't the government think that the member for Beauce's refusal to appear before the Public Safety Committee is a lack of ethics, transparency, and respect for parliamentary institutions? The Honourable Government House Leader.
This particular circumstance, when he was found to have left documents in an unsecured place, tendered his resignation, took responsibility for that act, and that resignation has been accepted. That's the kind of ministerial accountability I think Canadians want to see and want to expect from their representatives. That's the kind of responsibility that the member for Beauce took in this regard. And what's more, he recommended to the Prime Minister that Foreign Affairs conduct a full review of the matter, and that is exactly what is happening.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Another empty answer from the Government House Leader. We're still waiting for answers in the Cadman affair, the Brody affair, the Mulroney-Schreiber affair, the In-N-Out scandal, and obviously the Foreign Affairs Minister scandal. Every time the Conservatives and the Prime Minister know no limits, they've paralyzed parliamentary committees. Is the government aware that false representations on transparency and ethics have been broken systematically? The Honourable Government House Leader. Having listened to the question from the Bloc Québécois, it's obvious now that there was confusion between the Liberal Party and the Bloc Québécois. This is the Bloc's new strategy, is to be together, to very close ties with the Liberal Party to create confusion. The Honourable Member for Saint-Bruno-Saint-Hubert. It's hard to understand and hard to follow, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, members of the Ethics Committee voted in favour of examining the ethical practices of the Conservative Party's financing manoeuvres with their In-N-Out scheme in the 2006 campaign. There was an RCMP search even in their offices. Even though they slammed the door on this yesterday, and with since this morning's point of order was rejected, will the Conservatives accept the committee's decision and appear as witnesses? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board. Yes, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it was we Conservatives who wanted to have a study on election spending of all parties, including the Bloc and the Liberals and the NDP. But they're the ones that wanted to hide their own practices, their own election financing practices. We already know that the Bloc leader is the father of In-N-Out mechanisms. We Conservatives followed all the rules during the election, and that's why we're willing to defend our actions. The Honourable Member for Saint-Bruno-Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, the only spending in question and the only search was the Conservative parties. The Conservatives were in favor of the former Access to Information Commissioner's project, which would strengthen access to information. But today, the Conservatives are hiding documents, cabinet documents, as was decided by the courts. So are they going to change the current legislation to make ministerial office documents accessible? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board. Mr. Speaker, I find this question very interesting because the Bloc didn't want to expand the scope of the Access to Information Act when this was discussed at committee under the Federal Accountability Act. I'd like to know whether she would like to expand the Access to Information Act to include members' offices. I doubt it, Mr. Speaker. But our government, with the Federal Accountability Act, did expand access to information to the broadest scope it's ever had in this country. The Honourable Member for Outremont. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
4 years, the Liberals have come up with 4 different plans. 2005, Project Green. 2006, Building a Sustainable Future. 2007, Balancing Our Carbon Budget. And 2008, the Green Shift, Mr. President. Mr. Speaker, they've gone from doesn't get the job done to can't get the job done. Mr. Speaker, this Parliament has adopted legislation to put in a firm ceiling on greenhouse gas production. When is the government going to get away from its intensity base to full carbon?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is right. This House did endorse the government's policy on addressing the greenhouse gas challenges, our plan to reduce greenhouse gases by 20% by 2020. We did that when the whole House of Commons endorsed our throne speech, laying out that plan. It's a plan that's going to work, that's going to ensure that we see real reductions. It's a plan very different than the Liberal plan released yesterday, which talks an awful lot about how they're going to raise $15 billion in taxes, but has not one figure, not 1 ounce of greenhouse gas reduction included. That's why we've done something that delivers real results and takes real action.
The Honourable Member for Outremont. Mr. Speaker, the Government House Leader is wrong on a very important point. It's not the House that endorsed the throne speech. It's the Liberals who endorsed it and enabled the devastation of our environment to continue. We should think about our obligation to future generations. Can the government at least listen to Alain Lemaire, president of Castad, who yesterday once again criticized their so-called intensity-based targets, which are just as bad as the Liberals' plan, because in both cases there'll be an unlimited increase in greenhouse gas emissions. What's the government going to do to respect the rights of future generations? The Honourable Government House Leader.
Our plan is quite clear. It results in an absolute reduction in greenhouse gases of 20% by the year 2020. Though I will agree with the honourable member on one point. It is true it was the Liberals that did allow that throne speech to pass, thereby endorsing our environmental plan. That's why they haven't put forward a contrary environmental plan. All they've put forward is a tax plan yesterday, and it has one objective, to find a way around all those tax cuts that we brought in, reductions in the GST, because they need a lot of tax revenue to pay for the billions of dollars in promises they've already made. That's why they've got such an ambitious tax plan.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Mr. Speaker, before the Prime Minister makes ludicrous, angry statements on the environment, maybe he should listen to a preeminent Canadian environmentalist and a preeminent Canadian economist. David Suzuki has said that to oppose a carbon tax is just nonsense. Chief Economist Don Drummond said this morning the carbon shift idea is sensible and average Canadians will be better off. Is the Prime Minister seriously asking Canadians to believe that both David Suzuki and Don Drummond are crazy?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell you is crazy is telling Canadians that the way we're going to solve the environment is with a plan that includes a raft of taxes that hit every single Canadian but proposes not 1 ounce in reduction in greenhouse gases. That's crazy. It's not a green plan. It's not an environmental plan. It's a tax plan. And it might be the biggest tax plan Canadians have ever seen in their lives, and that's why we're not fear-mongering. They're afraid of the fear-mongering that's being spread by the Liberals with their tax plan.
Honourable Member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Mr. Speaker, Aaron Freeman of Environmental Defence says, quote, I can see this plan making a tangible difference to reduce greenhouse gases. Dale Marshall of the Suzuki Foundation says, this kind of a carbon plan is absolutely essential. Renowned economist Mark Shakard said, I've never met one economist who disagrees with the carbon tax. Could it be that the only economist who opposes this plan is the one who sits in the Prime Minister's office, insults the experts, underestimates Canadians, and refuses to address the biggest environmental challenge of our time? How crazy is that?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
I'll tell you the economists that object to the Liberal leader's tax plan. It's the economists that sit around the table, at the kitchen table at the end of the day, trying to balance that checkbook and pay those bills. They're the ones who the Liberal leader is insulted when he says, well, if you have computers, you need to change your behaviour. When he said if you have 2 residences, that would be a house and cottage, you need to change your behaviour. That's who's being insulted, ordinary Canadians, because the Liberal leader has decided they need to change their behaviour. They can't go to the cottage anymore. They shouldn't be on the internet anymore. They should just be gathering up their dollars and sending their taxes to him in Ottawa.
That's right. The Honourable
The Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, La Chine. Mr. Speaker, Arthur Sanborn of the Quebec wing of Greenpeace thinks the Liberal Green shift is way ahead of the NDP's plan. The Director General of Équiterre says this is the kind of policy we can support. Mr. Speaker, does the Environment Minister agree when he said yesterday that these Quebec ecologists were crazy? Does he agree with the Prime Minister? The Honourable Government House Leader.
The carbon tax plan is crazy. Someone who says a carbon tax is bad policy. And I'll quote. It's a quote from November 25th, 2006 in the Toronto Star. It's simply bad policy, he says, of a carbon tax. Who said that? The Liberal leader. Apparently he thought it was crazy. I don't know what's happened to him after a year and a half under siege in his caucus. I guess it's getting to him.
The Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, La Chine.
That quote is proof that Liberals can learn from their mistakes. The Conservatives have never done that. Not a single environmentalist, economist, or scientist, and not even any representative of the department has said that the Conservatives' plan was valid. 11 independent groups, including the CD Howe Deutsche Bank, the Pembina Institute, and Tyndale Institute, have described their plan as a charade. The Prime Minister is determined to make the country fall backward in the combating the worst ecological threat to our planet. That's crazy, isn't it? The Honourable Government House Leader.
From their mistakes, they'd be geniuses in Mensa today, but instead they're sitting on those benches because they refuse to learn from their mistakes, and they've done it again. Once again, they think the answer to solving Canadians' economic challenges is to massively increase taxes on everything, on shipping goods, on diesel for trucks, on home heating oil for Canadians. How is that going to help the economy? How is that going to help Canadians? It may be really good with the special interest groups that like high taxes. It ain't very good with the poor Canadian families, the senior citizen at home at minus 20 in the winter, trying to stay warm with a little bit of heating oil in the furnace.
The Honourable Member for Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives awarded a contract to, contrary to the contrary approach, and so the company chosen for other companies were not included. What's the government going to do to ensure that the Quebec aerospace industry gets the spin-offs from this contract? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works. All contracts awarded by this country, by this government, respect all the rules in place. The Honourable Member for Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel. Mr. Speaker, the aerospace industry in Quebec is seriously concerned about the low amount of and low quality of spin-offs. In other words, construction of containers, storage, and so on. The more attractive spin-offs under the Conservatives have gone elsewhere. Can the government confirm that better spin-offs are to come Quebec's way? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Industry Minister.
Not true. The aerospace industry is doing very well in Quebec. To date, the following regional amounts have been announced just by Boeing and Lockheed Martin are for Atlantic Canada, more than $294 million, Ontario, more than $341 million, but for Quebec, more than $660 million.
Wow.
For Western Canada, more than $341 million, and that's only the beginning, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable
member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, the Montreal area is mobilizing against the Conservatives' policy that destabilizes our economic model. The Montreal area, the Montreal City Council, and about 100 towns, including Quebec City, have all called on the Conservatives to restore funding to economic development organizations. What's stopping the scorched earth minister from revisiting his decision? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, I can assure you that all changes made to regional economic development are in the interest of economic development. It's in close cooperation with all economic stakeholders that we'll find the appropriate solutions in the interests of Quebec. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, a municipal councillor responsible for economic development in Montreal said, and I quote, "We support Minister Bachand. More appropriate steps have to be taken to support economic development in this region. A number of our successes, including aerospace, are based on and thanks to these organizations. The scorched earth minister, does he realize that he's seriously jeopardizing important industries like aerospace? Will he reconsider his decision?" The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. The economy is the Bloc's downfall. It's their nemesis. I'm not the one who said it. It's the member for Longueuil, Pierre Boucher, who said this in the Toronto Sun less than 3 years ago. The Honourable Member for Davenport. Mr. Speaker, apparently the member for Beauce is finally going to talk about the scandal he's involved in. Is he going to appear before the Parliamentary Committee or speak to the House of Commons to answer questions? No. Instead of that, the member is organizing a press conference. A press conference where he won't answer any questions from journalists. Does the government understand that by holding a press conference, when you answer no questions, you're hardly being transparent? The Honourable Government House Leader.
In question period, after the Liberals leader said he was happy to debate this serious issue of the carbon tax, we were finally seeing, after a year of questions that avoided policy, some questions on policy. The serious Liberal debate lasted 15 minutes. Now we're back where they love being, in the gutter, asking silly questions about people's private lives. We'll invite them to return with some serious questions, perhaps about their carbon tax policy, but I suspect they really don't want to talk about it that much.
The Honourable Member for Davenport.
Mr. Speaker, when we know that Julie Coulard had relationships with the Departments of Foreign Affairs, Transport, Human Resources, Public Works, Public Safety, not to mention the Mafia and Hells Angels. So yes, Canadians are interested in these relationships, as are the RCMP. The problem is that the government is hiding, and it has been since the scandal broke. How long until they realize that their cover-up has failed and they must call a public inquiry, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I know that Liberals are very interested in people's personal lives. I know the member for Markham Unionville, the Liberal member, has said the important question here is who has Julie Couillard been sleeping with. That's why we need to have a public inquiry. That's why we need to have them at the legislative inquiry. Well, you know what? With the greatest of respect, this government does not believe that's what Canadians are interested in. They might be interested in the big new tax plan from the Liberals. I know the Liberals don't want to talk about that, but we don't think they want to have public resources spent learning about people's private lives. To the extent that something serious in this matter is occurring, we're conducting a review through Foreign Affairs, and we think it will do fine work.
Honourable Member for Malpeque.
Mr. Speaker, last night the Conservative government was found by the federal court to have violated the right to freedom of expression by issuing gag orders against the Canadian Wheat Board. Judge Hughes ruled, and I quote, "It is hereby declared that the Governor and Council acted contrary to law by issuing said direction, and It is hereby declared that said direction contravenes the provision of subsection 2B of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Part 1 of the Constitution Act. Is there no law this government will not break in its attack on farmers' marketing institutions?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for the question, but I'm a little confused, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, during our throne speech, when we reiterated support for dual marketing for the wheat board, this member voted for it. Now he's voting against freedom of choice for the farmers. We can't figure it out. He also, at the Ag Committee the other day, voted to do a study on the carbon tax, on the damages it would do, the devastating damages it would do to agriculture. Now he's supporting the carbon tax. Mr. Speaker, I'd like that question answered. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Malpeque.
Avoiding the subject and confusion is all we get from the government, Mr. Speaker, but it is interesting to note that this session started with the federal court ruling the government illegally attempted to use its regulatory power to undermine the board. And this session ends with another federal court ruling the government imposed gag orders violating the right to free speech. But no one should be surprised by this government's illegal actions. Its record is of scandal, cover-up, and breaking the law. What does this government have against honesty and the rule of law?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food. Order.
Well, again, I'm going to thank the member for his question, Mr. Speaker, but I'm also going to answer this with a question, and this is a question from the constituents of Malpeque. Now, the constituents of Malpeque, and I made a couple of visits to the wonderful PEI, and here's the feedback I got. They have a question. They want to know how come their member has asked now 32 questions on the wheat board and only 2 on any issue that has anything to do with PEI. That's the question that they have for the member from Malpeque.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Luder.
Mr. Speaker, one of the primary challenges facing our manufacturing sector is the increase in fuel prices. Yesterday, the Liberal leader sent shockwaves across the country when he announced his plan to tax energy and the transportation of manufactured goods through his carbon tax grab. Increased transportation costs will ultimately result in consumers paying more for essential items like food and clothing. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Industry tell this House what effect the Liberals' carbon tax plan will have on those people working in the manufacturing sector?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Industry.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member from Edmonton-Leduc for all his hard work and his commitment to manufacturers. Manufacturers are facing U.S. economic difficulties, a strengthening Canadian dollar, rising international energy prices. And yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals had the audacity to look recently laid-off workers in the eyes and say, shift happens. To manufacturers that are struggling to cut input costs, the Liberal message is, we'll force you out of business. To truckers moving manufactured goods, the Liberals say pay $1,700 more per year, and we don't care if you go out of business. Mr. Speaker, workers know Liberal carbon tax on everything will take away their hard-earned money, and we will oppose the Dion tax trick every step of the way.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby New Westminster.
Mr. Speaker, the Republican candidate for the American presidency is in town, and the Conservatives will not be attending. The Prime Minister wants to stay away because of the help he's already given Mr. McCain on NAFTA. The Conservatives and the Republicans all agree that we should give up the workers to the interests of multinationals. Will the government confirm that it endorses Senator McCain's NAFTA strategy? The Government House Leader.
What we endorse is NAFTA. We believe it's been very good for Canadians. We believe it's been very good for Americans as well. It's been a very beneficial trade agreement that has resulted in the increase of hundreds of thousands of jobs in our economy, increased wealth and jobs in both countries. It's an agreement that we will continue to advocate in favor of, and we will do that with both Senator McCain and Senator Obama, both of whom we believe, when they examine what NAFTA has meant for Canadians, will endorse it strongly.
The honourable member for Burnaby New Westminster.
Well, they simply haven't done their homework, Mr. Speaker. Most Americans are earning less under NAFTA, and two-thirds of Canadian families as well are earning less.
Right.
So John McCain certainly doesn't have the interests of working families at heart. Now that Senator McCain wants to open up oil exploitation on all coasts, it's time to rethink our energy sellout. Canada needs an independent energy policy, and the needs of Canadians have to come first. Senator Obama says, let's change NAFTA. Is the government willing to reopen NAFTA so our energy resources serve Canadian needs?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that NAFTA has been a great benefit to all three NAFTA partners, to Canada, to the United States, to Mexico. It's led to a better environment, a better economy in all three countries, and will continue to bring benefits to all three countries into the future.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Cancel.
Mr. Speaker, the Defence Minister might want to put in for some overtime pay this morning because apparently he spent most of last night in his office. And how did this government announce the details of the $490 billion in defence spending? No fanfare, no press conference. They just posted them on the website in the dead of night. Sounds like a government with something to hide. When will this government start showing some respect for Canadians and actually demonstrate accountability? Why are they always trying to hide something?
They're sneaks.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's pretty rich. If you want to talk about the dead of night, let's talk about the decades of darkness under the Liberal government. The Prime Minister and the Defence Minister announced the Canada First Defence Strategy about a month ago. People wanted more details on it. It's been posted on our website, www.forces.gc.ca. Some members might want to consult that. They might learn something. What they will learn, Mr. Speaker, is that this government, this Prime Minister, this Defence Minister are finally shining a light after decades of darkness from the member from Wascana and his pals. The Canadian Forces love it. The Canadian people love it, and the people that count on the Canadian Forces love it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Cancel.
Speaker, when we asked for details about the government's defence spending plan, we were told the Prime Minister's speech was all the detail that Canadians needed. Worse, this plan started at $30 billion, went to $50 billion, then to $96 billion, and is now nearing $500 billion. Mr. Speaker, even Dr. Evil would be impressed with that. How many times is this minister going to have to engage in the only operation he's familiar with, damage control?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Well, let me help my honourable colleague with some figures, Mr. Speaker. The defence budget is going to increase to $30 billion a year by the year 2027-2028. If he does some simple math and adds those numbers up, he'll come up to the figure of $490 billion plus or minus $1 billion here or there. And Mr. Speaker, that money over 20 years is going to allow the Canadian Forces to do the jobs that we've given them to do, the jobs that previous government gave them to do, never funded them to do it. They should be ashamed of themselves. We've finally shone a light after a decade of darkness, and we're getting the job done, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Don Valley West. We'll have a little order.
Well, Mr. Speaker, speaking of what's a billion, here's the question about where's a billion. La Ministre du Patrimoine.
Minister of Canadian Heritage yesterday announced an official languages plan with a budget of $1.1 billion, but this was not part of the last budget, and it is of great concern because if the money comes from elsewhere, then other programs will probably suffer. Can the minister tell us where will this money come for her action plan on official languages? The Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government is very proud to invest $1.1 billion over 5 years through the new initiative, which is the end of the road.
They made their announcement on the famous carbon tax yesterday morning. We announced this program in the afternoon, so they weren't able to tax it. I think they're going to spend the entire summer finding new ways to tax Canadians in ways that they've never been taxed before.
The Honourable Member for Don Valley West.
What's a billion? Where's a billion? The Heritage Minister also reintroduced a watered-down version of the Court Challenges program that blatantly excludes minorities that are not linguistic minorities. Women are excluded. Gays are excluded. The disabled are excluded. Visible minorities are excluded. This is nothing less than discrimination. Why is the government refusing to allow all minorities to use the program and defend their rights.
Shameful. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Official Language.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our new program to protect linguistic rights emphasizes fundamental linguistic rights, those who are protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and constitutional texts. But let's keep in mind that the government contributes to promoting other constitutional rights of Canadians, including with its multiculturalism programs and its human rights programs, the Human Rights Commission, and the Employment Equity Program, as well as other individual initiatives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Gatineau. Mr. Speaker, the new action plan on official languages is somewhat mistaken when it comes to the relationship between French and English in Canada. It isn't English that is threatened, it is French that is threatened because it is spoken by a minority in Canada and in North America. To put both language minorities on equal footing is to deny reality and allow for the assimilation of francophones. Linguistic duality defended by the minister is perhaps a lack of caring for the French language and those who speak it. The Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, our government is very proud to invest $1.1 billion over 5 years through the new initiative, which is our roadmap. This is an improvement of 45%, and we reiterate our support for official languages. Yesterday, we introduced our plan. This is more evidence that our government keeps its provinces. The Bloc voted against our speech from the throne, against the 2008 budget, and they are against our new plan as well. The honourable member for Laval. Mr. Speaker, the new Court Challenges program only relates to linguistic rights and doesn't deal with groups that are discriminated against, including disabled people and homosexuals, and women aren't included, even though promises were made to advance their rights. Will this program be available to everyone, or once again will women, the disabled, and homosexuals be penalized by this homophobic, misogynist government? The Parliamentary Secretary. Once again, Mr. Speaker, our government is proud of its new support plan for linguistic rights based on improvement of regulations, and our program emphasizes fundamental language rights. It is also important to remember that the government contributes to the promotion of other constitutional rights of Canadians through other programs. Thank you.
For Thunder Bay Rainy River.
Mr. Speaker, the Ontario government recently announced a budget increase for the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund, money that supports economic development in the North. This increase makes the fund worth $100 million in 2011. In contrast, the similar federal program, FedNor, was cut by $6.4 million. This is another example of a provincial government doing the right thing while the federal government runs in the opposite direction. When will the Prime Minister start doing the right thing for Northern Ontario and restore FedNor's budget? Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting that this is the very first question since I've been here on this side of the House in over 2 years that has ever been posed about the situation in Northern Ontario. So it's very interesting that it should come. Let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government is committed to the development of Northern Ontario. Unlike the leader of the Liberal Party, who said during the leadership campaign that the people should move to where the jobs were. It was this government that announced $45 million in long-term stable funding for FedNor, over $60 million to support projects in Northern Ontario. Mr. Speaker, this Conservative government also signed a historic agreement with the U.S. to settle the softwood lumber dispute that significantly helped Northern Ontario. Where are they going to do after they have the carbon tax, Mr. Minister?
The Honourable Member for Ancaster, Dundas, Flamborough, Westdale.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition finally announced the details of his long-awaited tax grab.
With this shift, jet fuel prices will skyrocket, higher electricity costs will shock the average family, and home heating increases will burn through the wallets of Canadians. Thankfully for Canadian families, there's a Conservative government in town to stop the shift from hitting the fan. Unemployment is at a 33-year low in the country, and more than 750,000 jobs have been created since our government took office. Can the Minister of Human Resources tell Canadians how the proposed Liberal tax grab would affect the Canadian job market?
Minister of Human Resources and Social Development.
For the question, of course, the other day, Air Canada announced that 2,000 people were being laid off due to high fuel prices. And, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the Liberal Party took that as a sign that he should now go out and propose to raise taxes on fuel even higher and drive up fuel costs. Not only will this hammer airlines and manufacturing, Mr. Speaker, the trucking industry, the shipping industry, certainly auto manufacturers, it'll hammer everyone who uses energy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the Liberal carbon tax is well named because everything it touches turns to shift.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the law locks up the hapless felon who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater felon loose who steals the common from the goose. It's been 4 years since the accounting scandal at Nortel wiped out the savings of investors and seniors, yet only yesterday charges were finally laid against 3 executives. When are the Conservatives going to get beyond their tough-on-crime sloganeering and crack down on the white-collar criminals that prey on seniors and middle-class investors?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank the member for the question. As this is before the courts, it would be highly inappropriate to comment, as the member knows. But what I will comment on is, as this session comes to a close, is the tremendous gains we've made as a government in protecting law-abiding, innocent Canadians, safer streets, safer communities, a safer country for all Canadians. That's what we stand for.
Honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, if some native kid in my riding Winnipeg Centre gets busted for stealing hubcaps, this government would lock them up and throw away the key. And the reason they're not getting tough on white-collar crime is there's no jail cells left empty because it's full of Aboriginal people who are stealing a loaf of bread to feed their family. There is no regularity to this, Mr. Speaker. White-collar crime is a blue-collar issue, and we have to be able to trust the financial statements of the companies where our pensions are invested. So when are they going to get tough on crime in a realistic way and get busy like the states have done with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and try and get tough on crime and clean up the corporate boardrooms? Why do they let their buddies on Bay Street regulate themselves?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
You know, Mr. Speaker, it's really funny because right now and around election time, the NDP and the Liberals like to talk tough on crime, but when it comes time to actually taking action, putting in place the real steps that protect Canadians, protect young people, protect seniors, protect law-abiding citizens, where are they? Nowhere to be found. Our government is a government that stands up for law-abiding citizens. It's a government that knows that we have to end the revolving door justice system, and it's a government that's making our streets and our country safer for all Canadians.
The Honourable Member for London North Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Jose de Prado has just the kind of skills and work ethic that this country requires. For 9 years, his family has been a key contributor to London, Ontario's life and to the business community, but they are currently at risk of being deported to Brazil on July 3rd. While there is a humanitarian application waiting to be heard, we fear their loss in our whole community. This is just the kind of industrious family this government says it wants for Canada. They are now among us with a proven track record. Will the Minister of Immigration or the Minister of Public Safety show compassion, fulfill their own policy, and permit the de Prado family to remain while their application is reviewed?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no doubt I won't comment on a particular case, but I can say we have a refugee protection system that's a model for all of the world, and it has a number of processes in there. Many of them include applications such as humanitarian compassionate grounds applications. Those applications need to be made. We will treat them equitably and fairly, and we will look at each case compassionately. So I would ask this member to allow the process to take its course.
Honourable Member for Avalon.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's coastal communities have faced many challenges and hurdles, but continue on in the proud name of tradition and livelihood. This government has introduced tools to help Canadian fishers, such as the capital tax exemption when handing down their enterprise and the budding up system in some fisheries and reducing the GST by 2%. One thing that everyone involved in the fishery is aware of is that gas prices are making it harder and harder for fish harvesters to make a living and provide for their families. The member for Humber St Barb Bay Verde is telling people in Newfoundland and Labrador today of what he believes are the benefits of the Liberals' new tax grab. Would the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans enlighten us on how the proposed Liberal tax scheme will really affect our fishing communities?
Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt about the fact that fishermen are facing hard times trying to meet the cost of operations. And as the member mentioned, we have cut the GST, we brought in capital gains exemption, we helped them combine their fishing efforts to save money. We're reviewing licence fees. And what have the Liberals done to help? They've added increases to the gas tax. Mr. Speaker, I suggest that if they want to make a splash with this announcement, they go out and try to sell it to fishermen on the wharves. Then they'll make a splash.
That will bring to a conclusion the question period for today. Now, the Honourable Minister of Industry has a point of order, I believe, arising out of question period.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. As the session draws to a close, I rise in response to a point of order raised yesterday by the member from Timmins James Bay. The matter in contention, Mr. Speaker, was my use in question period yesterday of the initials B and S in too close proximity to one another and in too close proximity to the initials NDP, Mr. Speaker. Upon review, Mr. Speaker, the initials B and S have, in parliamentary tradition, been judged as too close to the agricultural vernacular, and I therefore apologize to you, Mr. Speaker, for the farming reference. With respect to my friend from Timmins James Bay, Mr. Speaker, while he and I will continue to have differing perspectives on the issue, we share a common birthplace in the Porcupine mining camp. In fact, our parents went to school together, and I therefore wish him a marvellous Northern Ontario summer, Mr. Speaker.
I'd like to respond to that point of order and my great respect for the House of Parliament and also my great respect for my honourable colleague who I love to get up in the morning and know that we're going to clash. As the great Tommy Douglas said, there's nothing like a good fight to make you want to get up in the morning. That being said, I think this member has always handled himself in a very classy manner, and I'm honoured actually to be able to cross swords with him. And yes, indeed, our family is from the same region. I won't say I was the worst hockey player ever born in Timmins, but in the top 10, I'm definitely there. Him, on the other hand, comes from a much greater lineage in terms of hockey players. However, we do certainly disagree, and I would like to wish him the best of the summer.
The honourable member for Thunder Bay, Rainy Rivers, rising out of point of order, rising out of question period.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, in question period, when I was asking my question, instead of getting a response, any kind of a straight answer, the Honourable Member Parliamentary Secretary for Fednor, being mathematically challenged, made mention that my numerous speeches here in the House at question period, standing orders, committees and in debates regarding my riding in northwestern Ontario. So I demand an apology, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Yes. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I can apologize for misleading the House because apparently it's been brought to my attention that in my absence while I was gone one weekend on a Friday, that apparently the House Leader did answer two questions regarding Northern Ontario, so I do apologize to the House for misleading them. Thank you.
Okay, now, before question period, the member for Edmonton Sherwood Park had the floor on a question of privilege. And we'll now hear the remainder of his remarks on his question of privilege.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. After the good wishes expressed by several of the members to each other and to all, I would like to reflect that and do the same for all of my colleagues. But meanwhile, I do need to continue with my grievance that I have. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to, just before I read into the record some of the actual words that occurred at committee, I want to make it very clear that my point of privilege this morning has to do with my freedom of speech, my ability to express myself on issues. And, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, I was a substitute member on the Ethics Committee last Tuesday when this particular thing happened. I want to point out to you, Mr. Speaker, on page 71 of Marlowe and Montpetit, there are these words: by far the most important right accorded to members of the House is the exercise of freedom of speech in parliamentary proceedings. It has been described as a fundamental right without which they would be hampered in the performance of their duties. It permits them to speak in the House without inhibition, to refer to any matter or express any opinion as they see fit, to say what they feel needs to be said in the furtherance of the national interest and the aspirations of their constituents. Now, further to this point, I would refer you to a ruling by Speaker Fraser on May the 5th, 1987. The privileges of a member are violated by any action which might impede him or her in the fulfillment of his or her duties and functions. Now, Mr. Speaker, my contention is that the actions of the Chair impeded me from debating the motion and from convincing my colleagues on the committee why this motion should be out of order. The Chair's obstructionist tactics caused the committee to descend into disorder to the point where I was not able to participate in the debate. Now, Mr. Speaker, I believe that it's important now in that context to point out that when the Chair finally gave me the floor to address the issue that was before the committee, I got to speak 4 words before he interrupted me. 4. And what were those offensive words that caused him to interrupt me? When he said, he named my name, "You have the floor," I said, "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." 4 words. And then he interrupted me. He was on such a roll of interrupting members who were speaking that it just seemed natural for him, when I opened my mouth, for him to interrupt me. Now, admittedly, what he said was nothing to do with my debate. It was a procedural thing, but he interrupted me after that. And then he said again, Mr. and then he named my name, "You have the floor if you wish." Well, Mr. Speaker, I guess I wished, because I put myself on I asked to be on the speaking list, and he had recognized me. And so then I said again, "Thank you." And I think it's important in the context of this debate to hear what I said at the committee, and that's why I want this in the parliamentary record. Here's what I said, a quotation from the record of the committee. "Mr. Chair, you know that over the years you and I have worked together in many different venues, different committees, and different functions. I would like to say that for the most part in those years I have had a good, healthy respect for you. Before I go into the topic of the debate today, I'd like to make a little comment here." Now, Mr. Speaker, I then went on to say, "I've observed that I've been here as long as you have, and some of the other members around the table. In the House, the Speaker gives wide latitude on giving individual members the freedom to make their speeches without interruption. It's really very wide. Even if someone stands up on relevance on a point of order, almost always the Speaker returns it to the member speaking and just gives him a little chastisement, but lets him make his speech." Now, Mr. Speaker, the reason I said that was because I observed that the Chair was always interrupting members when they spoke. And I wanted him to give me some kind of a commitment that I would be able to make my points without being interrupted and cut off. And so that's why I was doing this. Well, interestingly, Mr. Speaker, at that point he cut me off. All I was asking was that I would not be cut off, and with that he did. And you know, Mr. Speaker, what is so incredible is, you know, there's the switcher in the committees, the one who turns the mics on and off. They're usually just behind the Chair. And in this particular instance, that was also the case. He turned, the chairman of the committee turned around and motioned the switcher to switch my mic off. Now, all he would have had to do was to interrupt me. I'm used to stopping to talk. In fact, I have this cute little saying that says, "Don't talk while I'm interrupting," and it's totally meant in fun. Because I was taught when I was young that when someone else is speaking, you don't interrupt. And so all he would have had to do as the Chair was to say order or whatever, and I would have stopped speaking. As I did earlier today, Mr. Speaker, when we approached member statements, and you said we're going to cut your mic off right when I was talking about that. And it was a little bit of a humorous moment. But he interrupted me then, and gave me quite a long lecture, actually longer than the speech that I had made at that point. And so he once again returned the floor to me. And I said these two sentences before, once again, my mic was clicked off. This is what I said, direct quotation. I have a couple of things, Mr. Chairman, that I would really like to have on the record. This means that I'm asking you, please, to not shut off my mic while I'm speaking. As an MP who is, and I was going to go on to say, I have the privilege of expressing myself, and I wanted to cut off the tendency he had to not allow anybody to speak. And so I was peeling for that, and I wanted to get even just the warmest, fuzziest commitment from the chair of the committee that he would allow me to speak. He could have even gone on to say, as long as you're in order and all that, which I already know. But he didn't say that. Instead, Mr. Speaker, he cut me off, and he said, Mr. Epp, order. Well, okay, I stopped, because now he was going to speak. And then he gave another lecture about how he is the master of the committee. And I want to quote a little bit from that. He said, I encourage you in this second time now, and this is giving latitude just like the Speaker does, I want you now to move to your contribution to the debate on these motions and whether it will assist members in deciding whether any or all of these motions or amendments should be adopted. Well, Mr. Speaker, I had a very important point that I wanted to make. Because, you see, when we're in committee, or even in the House, what's the purpose of our words? I sometimes kid with my grandkids that Grandpa works in the word factory, that every day we get a quota and we're not allowed to go home until we've met our quota. So that's just a little bit of humor there with my grandkids. But we use words. In fact, I understand in my limited knowledge of the French language that parler means to speak, and this is parliament. We're here to speak. We're here to debate. We're here to persuade with our words. That's the purpose. And as the standing orders have said, and as the rulings from, or the comments in the document which I quoted from earlier, this is a fundamental privilege. But you know, Mr. Speaker, when we have an issue before the House that we want to persuade someone on, it's also important that votes be conducted fairly. And so I wanted to get this on the record. And so I was interrupted, and then, Mr. Speaker, I said this. I want to point out that when we come to take a vote on this motion, then the chair, I believe, should originally be impartial. Now, the reason I use the word original, if there's a tie vote, then, of course, the chair of the committee has to break the tie, just as the Speaker does here. So I wanted an assurance that it was understood, and I wanted this on the record. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, what the chair did on this particular occasion was, because there was a motion on the floor, and there were not enough Liberal members on the committee that were present, the chair did not call the meeting to order on time. In fact, he delayed the meeting for 7 minutes until Liberal members had dragged themselves in there. And then finally, he called the committee to order. Finally, he did that. So he was not impartial at the beginning. He should have started the meeting on time, as was scheduled. He chose not to, but the obvious reason was that he wanted to wait until, and there was quorum, Mr. Speaker. We had sufficient members. But he wanted to wait until there were enough members present to win the vote the way he wanted, before he was called upon to even break a tie. And so I was going to point that out, Mr. Speaker. And I also want to point out that later on, one of the Liberal members left. And so one of the members of the Conservative Party, because we're here, after all, to persuade Parliament and to make sure that the vote on this motion does not carry, because it is clearly out of order of the mandate of this committee. And so you have to persuade, but also when the vote is conducted, it has to be a fair vote. We want that vote to be defeated on high principle that the committee is out of order in actually even addressing this issue. It's beyond their mandate. Parliament hasn't given them that mandate. The House of Commons hasn't given them that mandate. They have taken it on themselves. And through the tyranny of the minority majority on the committee, the minority parties are in majority there, they have moved a motion that is out of order, and you, Mr. Speaker, have ruled that it can't be considered by you until the committee goes and does its report. But that's what we find offensive. What they are trying to do with this motion that is out of order is they're trying to achieve a goal that they couldn't do if it was ever ruled in advance. And that's the thing that's really very, very
We're on a question of privilege, and that takes precedence over a point of order, so I'm afraid the honourable member for Timmins, James Bay, may have to wait a little while till this question of privilege argument is done.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the chair at this point made a decision that even though I was going to speak, I don't know how he knew what I was going to say, but even though he knew that I was going to say something that he didn't like, he decided to shut me off. And so he said, Mr. Speaker, and again I quote, Mr. Epp, Mr., and then he named my name, for the third time, I have to tell you that you are discussing matters which are not relevant to the motion. Now, Mr. Speaker, all I was doing was trying to get him to give me the privilege of being able to speak and to give me an assurance that he wouldn't do to me what he did to the others before. And you can read the record from that committee, Mr. Speaker, to find out what I'm talking about. Now, he said, you're discussing matters which are not relevant to the motion, and he gave another member the floor. So I was not permitted to address the issue. I was not permitted to actually say anything. I don't know how he knew that what I was going to say was going to not be relevant. He just assumed that, I presume, because I happen to be a member of the governing party, which is in a minority in numbers in this place, and so he decided that he would just rule. So therefore, Mr. Speaker, as a result of this, I was not able to address the issues. I want to also, Mr. Speaker, point out to you, and this is very, very important, he has, the chair of the committee has taken it upon himself to shut down the debate in this committee. Now, Mr. Speaker, you know, he was not able to do this within the rules. He did it outside the rules because, as you have said numerous times, and until the rules are changed, the rules are that committees are masters of their own proceedings. And committees can do, they have a lot of latitude with respect to their procedures. But I commit, Mr. Speaker, not with respect to their mandate. They don't have that. And so the motion that we're talking about here, of course, in committee, directly impedes that mandate. He, notwithstanding that in the committee there had never been a motion that limited the length of speeches, he took it upon himself, without such a motion, to limit the length of speeches. And that is a direct violation of my right, my ability as a member of Parliament to speak in committee or in the House. I would like to point out, Mr. Speaker, that in this particular committee, no routine motion has ever been held which limited the number of speakers or the length of speeches on these committees. And so, Mr. Speaker, you know, I've observed this. Whenever we are debating an issue here in the House, every time when somebody is finished with his intervention, the Speaker says, resuming debate. And if no one stands, he usually says, resuming debate. And if someone stands up, and the time limit in the House of Commons has not yet been reached, then that member has the freedom to speak. Well, Mr. Speaker, this chairman of this committee doesn't follow even those elementary procedures of a democratic debate. He just simply says, time's up. And even though it's not part of my privilege, Mr. Speaker, although it leads into it, the reason that I am raising this is because now my ability to bring my thoughts to the committee have in fact been ended. Because yesterday, without any further notice, he just said, I'm calling the vote, and even though other members were saying debate, he refused to recognize them. He does not have the right to do that, Mr. Speaker. As I said, even in this House, the Speaker says, resuming debate. And if someone rises, they're given the opportunity to debate. It's only when no one rises that the Speaker says, "Are you ready for the question?" or "Is the House ready for the question?" Mr. Speaker, this chairman of this committee failed to do that. He didn't say, "Is there any further debate?" In fact, there were a number of members who still wanted to speak, and they were not given the right to speak because he shut it off and conducted the vote, which he knew would go that way. So it's not impartial, Chair, and it's one that has substantially reduced the right and the privileges of members to conduct in free and open debate. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say that because this motion had never been carried, the Chair is totally out of order, and I would like to appeal to you, Mr. Speaker, that you would rule that I have a prima facie case of breach of privileges, and if you so rule, I would be prepared to make the proper order so that it would go to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee where these things go. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Mr. Speaker, at the outset I want to commend you for your great years of service in the House and how frustrating it must be to have to sit and listen to such irrelevancy day after day coming from these kind of members. I'm actually astounded that time is being taken up in this House by hearing someone cry such sad crocodile tears. It's like the two kids in the sandbox and he took my toy, no he didn't. I think Canadians expect better of us. Mr. Speaker, the issue that we're dealing with here is the ability of a committee to actually deal with the government's business. And what was brought before us, Mr. Speaker, he talked about how he was shut down because this chair said it was irrelevant. Well, we sat and listened to, was it 20 minutes of absolutely irrelevant testimony from him about how his feelings were hurt, Mr. Speaker. And I say it's irrelevant because he must know the basic rules of Parliament. The Speaker is not in the position to step in and intervene and hold his hand and take him back to the classroom and say, "Bad chair." That's not the role of the Speaker. He must know that we have certain rules of Parliament that go back hundreds of years that establish fair debate so that a government party that's still in his mind as a rump opposition can't undermine the rules of Parliament, that they can't block committees day after day, that they can't put up filibusters week after week. I mean, we're talking about an unprecedented situation, Mr. Speaker, where a governing party has tried everything it can to shut down the work of Parliament. And it keeps coming back to this fact of that this is a party, also a government, that's been charged and had an RCMP raid. And so questions have to be raised about the ethical nature of what was done. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't think I need to get into the whole very dubious and dodgy past of the Conservative Party with election spending. That's not. We don't have enough time. That's not the issue. Yes, it would take us, Mr. Speaker, into mid-July, and I think that people want to get home. What I'm raising here is the question of why he is taking up the time of Parliament, raising an absolutely irrelevant point, because he knows full well, Mr. Speaker, that even in the rules of Parliament, Mr. Speaker, you know well that I'm a great student of the rules of Parliament. That the
yes, you're a scholar.
That the point of order has to be taken through the committee. It's not for him to come and cry to the principal that the teacher did something wrong in his classroom. The rules are very clear here, Mr. Speaker. It says, unlike the Speaker, the chair of a committee does not have the power to censor, disorder, or decide questions of privilege. Should a member wish to raise a question of privilege in the committee, or should some event occur in committee which appears to be a brief of privilege, the chair of the committee will recognize the member and hear the question of privilege, or in the case of some incident, suggest that the committee deal with the matter. This is to be dealt with by the committee, and if the committee rules that there was an issue, the member quite rightly can bring it to them, then it is brought to the Speaker, and then the Speaker rules. And what's happened here, Mr. Speaker, is that we've seen this bizarre filibuster in Parliament since 10 o'clock this morning, where very, very important issues of parliamentary law has not been debated. I mean, the issue of the nuclear liability, which the Democratic Party is absolutely opposed to, has been completely shunted to the side. The bizarre airline safety bill that this government has been trying to push through, this government has shunned aside, and they've been bringing up irrelevant issues. So, Mr. Speaker, the question that we're dealing with here is why is this member taking up the time of Parliament to cry foul over their filibustering techniques in a committee where the track record has already been that they basically shut down committee after committee with the same kind of shenanigans, and finally a chair has to rule. that there is a question of absolute irrelevancy about what they were speaking about. And I'm sorry if his feelings were hurt, Mr. Speaker, but this is the big boys' chamber. We're paid here to be professionals, to stand up and do our job. So he knows full well, Mr. Speaker, that he can't appeal to you to intervene. This is not the way Parliament works. And so, Mr. Speaker, I don't know, perhaps there needs to be some parliamentary lessons over this summer. I would actually encourage that we maybe through our wonderful clerk's office, offer members of Parliament, especially the Conservative backbenchers, maybe a summer course where they could come and actually learn some of the basic rules of Parliament, Mr. Speaker. I think it is a very good thing for all of us to actually learn. And someone who has come into my second term of Parliament, I've found the clerks have been excellent at being able to show us so that we do not stand up in the House, Mr. Speaker, and actually embarrass ourselves or our constituents. So at the end of the day, what has happened here in the House has been a bizarre and useless filibuster by the Conservatives, keeping important and very controversial bills from coming forward at the end of the session. But it's also undermining our parliamentary role here, because we're seeing attempts to create ad hoc rulings, to change the hundreds of years of tradition in terms of how things are reported through the committees and then to the Speaker, trying to ask the Speaker to unilaterally override the committee tradition, especially on a point, Mr. Speaker, where the committee was trying to do the work of Parliament. And that's what I have to keep getting back to. This was a committee that was finally said, enough's enough. We've heard all the irrelevant banter of this party that's fundamentally an opposition party, that we have to get down to the work of Parliament. So, Mr. Speaker, I appeal to you. You know the rules, you respect the rules, and I don't think you'll be swayed by such a model and display as what we've just seen from our member from Edmonton. And I certainly encourage, Mr. Speaker, you to have a wonderful summer, and that all your staff to have a wonderful summer. Mr. Speaker, I know that my colleagues on the block as well want to wish you a wonderful summer, because, you know, you do take the brunt of having to listen to many parliamentary debates that are... Yes, Mr. Speaker, it is a point of privilege, and my point of privilege is the privilege of serving in this House under you as Speaker, and I'm certainly thankful for that. So, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I too rise on a point of privilege. I have before me some information that will be very troubling to you concerning the conduct of the chair of the Standing Committee on Ethics. Before I go into that information, I'd like to read a quote. Speaker Fraser stated in his ruling of May 5th, 1987, quote, "The privileges of a member are violated by any action which might impede him or her in the fulfillment of his or her duties and functions." Today I rise to inform you of such an incident where my privileges were violated by a chair who took action to impede the fulfillment of my duties, that impeded me from fulfilling my duties and functions as a member of that committee, as an associate member of that committee. The matter relates to a motion which was moved by the Chair.
I hesitate to interrupt the honourable member, but we're dealing with a question of privilege raised by the honourable member for Edmonton Sherwood Park at this moment. So if this is a separate question of privilege, then I think the member should restrict his remarks to that.
Now, the incident in question occurred at the Standing Committee on Ethics, and we've heard from the member from Alberta who has indicated that his rights and privileges as a member of Parliament were impeded by the actions of a chair who was willing to ignore the rules and overturn the ability of members to speak their minds and carry out their duties. Now, the member from Alberta explained earlier on that the chair prohibited him from speaking, but it was much worse than just speaking, Mr. Speaker. This chair refused to even entertain amendments to the motion that was before the committee. Now, amendments are not only permitted, they are a regular, run-of-the-mill component of committee and parliamentary debate. I've almost never seen a document go through this place without being amended. But the chair of the Ethics Committee took the position that amendments are not allowed if they change the motion. Well, if you look up the definition of an amendment, Mr. Chair, without changing a motion, an amendment is not an amendment. An amendment, by its very nature, is a change. To amend is to change. The two words are synonymous. Now, in particular, the chair indicated that the motion which sought to investigate the electoral practices of the Conservative Party was allowed, but that any amendment that would expand the motion to investigate the financial practices of his party or any opposition party was not allowed. He said this is because his committee, the Committee on Ethics, is not allowed to study the actions of parties. But the motion in question states explicitly that it wants to study the actions of the Conservative Party. It does not say that it wants to investigate the actions of Conservative public office holders, but rather of the Conservative Party of Canada, and I quote, for the Ethics Committee chair to suggest that only one party can be investigated by his committee infringes on the privileges of members of all political parties in this House. The privilege to which I speak now is the right to be treated equally regardless of party affiliation. So the chair of the committee indicated that only one party could be investigated and that all the other parties would be exempt from any scrutiny whatsoever. Now, it would have been unfair if committee members from the opposition had amassed their votes and suppressed the right of Conservative members to investigate the financial practices of all parties. That would have been unfair and wrong. But this committee chair went even further than that when he said that it was not only the right of committee members to vote down such inquiry of their finances, but that it was completely out of order for such an amendment to even be considered. In other words, Chair, he structured the entire meeting in a way that would allow a motion to survive and pass only if it focused exclusively its scrutiny on the Conservative Party. In essence, this is a partisan...
I hesitate to interrupt the honourable member again, but it sounds to me as though he's arguing a point of order, not a question of privilege. The question of what amendments or whatever are in order in a committee is not a matter of privilege. Clearly, we're dealing with a question of privilege here raised by the member for Edmonton, Sherwood Park, which deals with his right to speak, freedom of speech. That is not the admissibility of amendments, and so I hope the honourable member move very quickly to deal with privilege, not a point of order.
And what I was you're very right that if we were to focus on the admissibility of amendments, then you're right, that would be traditionally a point of order. However, what I'm dealing with here is the privilege of the member for Alberta to speak freely by amending a motion. Now, I will not focus any more on this point, as I believe it has been well exhausted, but I think that you should note that that privilege, which is afforded to all members have the privilege to amend motions, was infringed upon by a heavily partisan chair bent on advancing his own partisan interests. On the subject of the member's point of privilege, Mr. Chair, the member for Alberta is correct to say that he was not even capable of uttering a full sentence before being aggressively interrupted by a highly partisan chair who would abruptly push any member who tried to speak off of the speaking list and silence them immediately. Now, I know the member for Alberta who spoke earlier to be a real statesman of this House, and he he presented himself in the committee to make intelligent arguments on behalf of his constituents and advance careful consideration of a highly partisan motion. He was interrupted again and again and again by a chair who did not want that member to have his voice heard. Mr. Speaker, the chair has a right to his private opinions. This particular chair is heavily opinionated. We all know that. That is his right, but it is not his right to impose his personal opinions and his personal urges on that committee. And that is exactly what he did in denying the privileges of the honourable member for Alberta, from Alberta, to speak his mind freely in that parliamentary setting. Now, I was present throughout, and I can corroborate exactly what the member from Alberta indicated, and I can tell you that my privileges were equally denied. Now, I know that we're not speaking of my privileges at this point. However, it is important to show that there is a pattern here. There's a pattern of behavior amongst this chair who refuses to permit members of the committee to carry out their work and to speak freely, which is a fundamental right of members of any committee. Now, as we move forward in this discussion, Mr. Chair, I think that you will find that that this committee cannot go on functioning like this, because it will deny members of the committee the privileges with which they were vested when they were elected by their constituents. Now, this chair might not be pleased with the fact that the members on this side were elected and given the privileges of parliamentarians. He might not be happy about that, and it's his right to be displeased with the choice of Canadians in the last election. But it is not his right to take away their choice by silencing the members that Canadians have elected. That is exactly what he is attempting to do by silencing the member for Northern Alberta and by silencing other members of the same committee. Mr. Chair, the intention of Conservative members on the committee was to see a fulsome investigation of the financial practices of all political parties in this House, including our own. We are more than happy to defend and investigate and have investigated our finances, and that is what the member was speaking about at the moment that he was interrupted, just to show you that the topic on which he was intervening was completely germane and therefore totally permissible in the committee context. He was indicating as well that he wanted to see an investigation of the Conservative practices in concert with a similar investigation of all parties. Now, if I could, move to my final point, Mr. Speaker, by reiterating the words of your predecessor, one of your predecessors, Speaker Fraser, and in the quote that I raised earlier, I'd like to unpackage it a little bit more. It says, "The privileges of members are violated by any action which might impede him or her in the fulfillment of his or her duties and functions." Speaking in a parliamentary committee is a duty and a function of a parliamentarian. Were the member for Alberta to refuse to speak in committee, he would be abdicating his duty to represent his constituents. Were he to be prevented from speaking in that same committee, he would be deprived of his ability to carry out the functions of a member of Parliament. And as such, Mr. Speaker, it is not only permitted for him to speak, it is essentially obligatory that he do speak. He was denied the right to do that, to carry out his functions and shoulder his duties when the chair slammed that gavel again and again with the fury and wrath of a Northern Ontario thunderstorm, Mr. Speaker. And at the end of the day, I hear that there are other members who have that same wrath right now because they don't want any of these matters to be discussed. So it is the duty of the Speaker of the House in circumstances, extraordinary circumstances like these, to intervene with the chair and indicate to him that he hasn't the right or the responsibility to silence members of the committee with whom he disagrees. And I would invite you, Speaker, to read the standing orders. And we know that you are a master of those standing orders already, but if you would review them and then look at the comportment of this chair, and you will find that he has acted in a way that is out of line with the standing orders and out of line with the privileges that are vested in that member through our traditions in this House. And finally, Speaker, I would point out, in addition to wishing you a good summer, and I hope that you have a chance to reconnect with your friends over the summer in Kingston and here, right across Canada indeed, but I would like to say, Speaker, to you, that you have set a tone of responsibility and parliamentary privilege in this House that no one has contested, but it is being undermined by one of the chairs of the parliamentary committees. And I invite you to remind him of the spirit and tone that you have set in this House. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, and I wish you and yours a terrific summer. Thank you.
The honourable member for Outremont. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After hearing both members from the government side, I think they have a hard time in understanding what a question of privilege really is, and I will quote from our procedure document here in the House that states that a great deal of importance must be placed on questions of privilege. When a member who wishes to raise a question must first convince you, Mr. Speaker, that his concern is a prima facie, or at first blush, if you will, a question of privilege. And your duty is to determine whether or not the matter would allow the member, would affect the member's work or the work of the House of Commons. Elmer Dreger, who wrote a number of texts to interpret legislation, gave us a golden rule, that is, that any interpretation of a rule or standing order or any rules that apply here must be done by taking into account the context, and the context of a question of privilege can't be used as a pretext to discuss once again a decision that has already been made by a parliamentary committee. And I submit with respect that this is exactly what the Conservatives are attempting to do here today. They have been raising a number of arguments for some time now, and reduced to their most simplest expression, this simply involves revisiting the work that is done by members in committee. So it seems to me that prima facie this is not a question of privilege, and you should rule along those lines, Mr. Speaker. Let's look at what is happening here. The government, even though it is a minority government, still has all of the rights and privileges and powers incumbent upon them. And this is not like the American system, where the executive, here our executive branch sits in Parliament and is part of the legislative branch. The only time when the fact that you are elected as a parliamentarian makes any true sense is when all four parties sit on a parliamentary committee. Canadian voters, in voting in a minority government, decided the following, and that is that from now on the government will have to respect the will of the majority of the voters. And after 10 hours of debate, the chair of the Ethics Committee ruled that there had been enough debate. He didn't remove the right to speak from anyone. What he told the member for Sherwood Park and others was that this is enough, and we as members, elected members, not the executive branch, not cabinet, but the elected members who are sitting together on a parliamentary committee will make decisions relating to the public interest. The decision was made together, and members had every opportunity. After 10 hours, they had had an opportunity to bring forward their point of view. And we shouldn't allow a filibuster, and this comes from a French word, filibustier, and the pirates are trying to take control of our ship. This should not be allowed, Mr. Speaker. There must be a respect of the fundamental rules of Parliament, which means that each parliamentarian must have the right to speak. That is true. But it isn't in allowing people to speak for more than 10 hours, all the while repeating the same thing, that we are honoring Parliament or the parliamentary committees that are creatures of Parliament. The only way to deal with the members' request is to reject it out of hand, because it isn't a question of privilege. It's a roundabout way to appeal to the chair to once again appeal a decision that was made by the chair of a parliamentary committee, something that was supported by the majority of the members sitting on that committee, and they represent the majority of Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Brampton, Mississauga South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was listening very carefully to the comments made by the member from Nepean Carleton, and from his remarks, I would really like to ask him if you could table the book that his whip, the government whip, provided on dirty tricks. That would really show us and really tell us what partisanship is all about. And I wanted to put that on the record since they tend to talk about it so often.
That's, I don't think, necessary for determining this question of privilege. The l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Weber. Mr. Speaker, thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. I wasn't able to do it yesterday. When I was at the Ethics Committee, I indicated to the chair and to the clerk that I wanted to speak to the motion that was being debated, as well as to the various amendments that had been brought forward. I was on the list of speakers, that is the list of members who wanted to speak, and I was never given an opportunity to speak. I couldn't even say, Mr. Chairman. I was completely overlooked. I didn't have an opportunity to say a single word. Now, I'm not a member with a great deal of experience. I've only been here for 2.5 years, but there's something that I do know, and that is that a chairman cannot limit the speaking time until a committee has agreed on limiting that time. And there was no vote taken on limiting the speaking time of members, and since I didn't have an opportunity to say a single word, how can one say that I was repeating something that had already been said, since I said nothing? Mr. Speaker, I've traveled recently to some African countries where the right to speak had been taken away from individuals, and look at the type of reaction when we talk about democracy, when we talk about respecting others. On their side, once again, the result is zero. They have no respect, and they simply engage in personal attacks against others. Mr. Speaker, what I simply wanted to submit here to you is that, having not had the opportunity to say one word on this subject, it's a total lack of respect. Respect for my fellow citizens, the people whom I represent here in Ottawa, the fact that I was kept silent, that my rights as a parliamentarian were thwarted, and it's totally unacceptable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that the chair has heard enough on this matter. And there's another member that I would like to hear before ruling on this, and that is the chair of the committee, who is not here today, and this is a question of privilege that involves something that he did at committee.
Attention to a ruling I made on June 12, 2003, concerning privilege in committee. And while I'm not citing this as the final authority at the moment on this issue, I would point out that I said at that time our parliamentary system is predicated on freedom of thought and expression, and indeed encourages active debate. I would remind honourable members that conflict and differences of opinion are inherent in the work we do as members of Parliament. On the other hand, members are expected to conduct themselves with decorum and to show respect for their colleagues in committee, just as they are in this place. Establishing and maintaining a working environment in committee that respects both these principles is entirely within the responsibility of the committee and its members. And while it is regrettable that there continues to be tension between members of the Standing Committee, I would point out once again that there has been no report from the committee, and therefore the matter remains one which, in the first instance, the committee itself must deal with. I'm not saying those words apply fully to the case before us because I haven't heard everything about it, but I point those out to honourable members, and it may help later. Tabling of documents. Another point of order. The honourable member for Burnaby New Westminster.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You'll recall many hours ago, it seems now, this morning I rose at the same time as the House Leader for the Conservative Party on points of order, and you chose the House Leader first. He's raised his point of order. Subsequent to that, of course, we've had the discussion. I wanted to raise a very brief point of order, Mr. Chair, and that is to go beyond the thanking of the pages that was held yesterday. A number of representatives from a number of different parties expressed their support and their thanks for the good work that the pages do in the House.
Hear, hear.
I would just like to, on behalf of the NDP, broaden that thanks to all of the parliamentary personnel, the bus drivers who drive the green buses that take us around Parliament Hill, the individuals that do the cleaning and cooking on Parliament Hill, the custodians. All of those individuals do a tremendous job in our community, and they ensure, Mr. Speaker, They ensure, Mr. Speaker, indeed, that when we are away from home, as we are in virtually all cases, except for representatives from the National Capital Region, when we are away from home, we feel very much at home because of all of their efforts and all of their work. And on behalf of the NDP caucus, I'm sure members from all four corners of the House will join us in saying thank you to all the personnel on the Parliament Hill.
I think that's agreed. Tabling of documents. Pursuant to Section 91A of the Parliament of Canada Act, it is my duty to present to the House the annual report of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner on activities in relation to the Conflict of Interest Code for members of the House of Commons for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2008. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 36.8, I have the honour to table in both official languages the government's response to 7 petitions.
Vote of document.
Tabling of documents.
Government bills. Déclaration de ministre.
Statements by ministers.
Reports from interparliamentary delegations. Présentation.
Presenting reports from committees.
Introduction of private members' bills. Mr. Baines, seconded by Mr. Silva, moves for leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Special Import Measures Act, Environmental Costs. This motion is deemed adopted. The Honourable Member for Mississauga, Brampton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill helps to make it easier for Canadian companies to compete globally while complying with our environmental legislation and regulations. It ensures that foreign companies that export to Canada are penalized when their home governments refuse to enforce their own environmental laws in order to subsidize their products when cases of dumping are considered. Conversely, it ensures that Canadian companies who comply with Canada's environmental laws and regulations have those costs considered as part of their cost of production in dumping cases. My bill, Mr. Speaker, provides clarity to the government and protects Canadian companies from outsourcing carbon emissions which don't respect national borders. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, this bill will help to build a strong green economy for the 21st century.
Mr. Baines, seconded by Mr. Silva, moves that the bill be now read a first time and be printed. Cette motion.
This motion is deemed adopted.
First reading of this bill, première lecture de ce projet de loi.
Shall the bill be read for a second time?
sitting of the House. Dépôt de projet de loi émanant des députés.
Introduction of private members' bill.
Senate public bills. Mrs. Jennings, seconded by Mr. Boshkoff, moves that Bill C-209, an act to amend the Criminal Code, Protection of Children, be now read a first time. This motion is deemed adopted. The honourable member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce-la-Chine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's quite an honour for me to sponsor this bill S-209 here in the House. This bill would repeal Section 43 of the Criminal Code. Section 43 of the Criminal Code provides the justification available to school teachers, parents, and persons standing in the place of parents to use force as a means of correction toward a pupil or a child under their care. Mr. Speaker, there are growing numbers of countries that have removed the availability of corporal punishment to children. As well, Canada signed and ratified the Convention on the Rights of Children in 1991, and that convention calls on all of the state parties, so that includes Canada, to take all appropriate legislative measures in order to protect the child from all forms of physical or mental violence, injury, abuse, and so on. Mr. Speaker, there has been a longitudinal study here in Canada of children that shows that children who are subjected to corporal punishment show behavioral problems, including aggression towards other children, bullying towards other children. So I would call on my members here in the House to support the repeal of Section 43 of the Criminal Code and protect our children.
Mrs. Jennings, seconded by Mr. Boshkoff, moves. The motion's already been put. When shall the bill be read a second time? Next sitting of the House. Prochaine séance de la Chambre. Première lecture de projet.
First reading of Senate public bills.
Motions. The honourable member for Edmonton-Leduc.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to present a motion. I believe on this motion there have been consultations with all parties, and if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent. The motion is as follows: that at any time the House stands adjourned during June or July 2008, the Standing Committee on Health or the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development has ready a report. When that report is deposited with the clerk, it shall be deemed to have been duly presented to the House.
Honourable member for Edmonton-Leduc have the unanimous consent of the House to propose this motion. D'accord.
Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? Agreed. Carried.
Second, Mr. Dewar, seconded by Mr. Julian, moves that the third report of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development, presented on Monday, January 28, 2008, be concurred in. Debate. The honourable member for Ottawa Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from British Columbia for seconding this motion. Mr. Speaker, this report was actually tabled in the House of Commons just after the new year. It was a report that was an interim report, if you will, Mr. Speaker, by the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development with regards to Afghanistan. And, Mr. Speaker, it's important to note, in fact, the motion that was just adopted, which will allow our committee's report to be tabled when it's finalized, hopefully within a couple of weeks. This was the interim report of this final report. And, Mr. Speaker, we have studied at Foreign Affairs Committee the issue of Afghanistan and our country's involvement there for better part of a year. In fact, my predecessor, the member for Halifax, had brought forward a motion for a study on Afghanistan. Of course, you know that then the House was prorogued. I became the member on the committee for our party and continued put a motion forward to continue the work that had been done. We then had the opportunity to file a table report, an interim report, if you will, simply because it was important for the committee to bring forward the evidence that we heard at committee from witnesses before the Manley report, ideally, but before we had the motion in the House to extend the war in Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, recent reports out of Afghanistan show that we really haven't been able to provide a sufficient foreign policy framework to deal with the complexities of the war in Afghanistan. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if you look at particularly the motion that was passed in this House, thanks to both the government and the opposition party extending the war, you'll note that what was missing and continues to be an empty space is how we are able to get out of this kind of military approach and what is a counterinsurgency war-making approach and move towards something that is going to bring peace to the people of Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, at committee and in this report that was tabled that I'm concurring today, it was clear from all of the witnesses, in fact, there was a consensus from the military to people working in peace and development to the voice of everyday Afghans and others, that the situation in Afghanistan cannot be won militarily. Everyone agrees with that. And Mr. Speaker, it's strange in many ways is that while there's that consensus, that on the one hand, everyone believes that there isn't a military solution to the war in Afghanistan, that the motion that was put forward by the government with the help of the opposition Liberal Party focuses on military solutions. I simply point to, Mr. Speaker, the only concrete thing we've seen from the motion to date has been three things: more troops, more helicopters, and more drones. Everything else has been vapid, vague, and certainly not anything that will help move towards peace and development in Afghanistan. I say that out of sadness more than anger, Mr. Speaker. Sadness because Canadians and others in the global community would like to see Canada taking a role in terms of pushing peace, moving out of the counterinsurgency, this kind of one-size-fits-all military approach. We heard at committee, Mr. Speaker, from people who are well experienced in diplomacy. We heard from former diplomats. We heard from advisors. Sadiq Wira comes to mind, advisors to the Afghan government about where we're at in the war in Afghanistan. And it was absolutely clear that to continue this kind of approach from a military perspective was not going to make matters better, in fact, make matters worse, and further to that, would make matters worse in the long run. Sadiq Wira, as I was mentioning, provided an analysis that I think is important. He said that, and remember, this is an Afghan advising the Afghan government presently. He said if you were to view Afghanistan right now, you should view it through the lens of more of a civil war that has taken place. And certainly if you go back to the period from when the Soviets left to right up until 9/11, there was still an ongoing civil war. And I guess for many of us, we should understand that simply because the way this war has been cast, it's been simply, the Taliban versus, I guess, the rest of the world. And it's not the case at all on the ground. What we have is very different groupings, Taliban being one for sure, but other insurgents, warlords, regional powers at play within Afghanistan. And his point was this: what we have done is what we've decided that we will lay hands on one group in the civil war over the other. And he encouraged at committee that Canada take a different role in this whole conflict, to push reconciliation and peace, to ensure that the approach that we're taking is not going to simply say, well, we believe that this side is the right side and the other side is not. This is very different from, I believe, how this government sees the conflict in Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, and others. Mr. Wira went on to say that in order to change things on the ground in Afghanistan, what you need to do is, instead of just putting in solutions that are top-down, that bottom-up needs to be happening. And he gave a couple of things that he thought would be helpful. Going to the ground level, if you will, be it in the south or other regions within Afghanistan, and building what he calls peace capacity. In other words, how do you get some of these issues solved? Some of these issues I might mention, Mr. Speaker, have to do with conflicts over water, over resources, over boundaries regarding farmland, etc. That have been issues not just in the past couple of years since 9/11. The fact goes back beyond 92 when the Civil War raged after the Soviet Union left. He believes that's an approach that it's the art of the possible. He believes that these conflicts that have nothing to do with the war that we are seeing on our TV, that is the conflict between the Taliban and NATO and OEF, that these ones are ones we can actually solve right now. We don't see that kind of diplomatic peace-building approach from our government. We heard testimony at committee from people like Mr. Wira and others that say that we should be approaching that. Why? Because these things can be dealt with right now. There is prospects for peace, believe it or not, right now in Afghanistan. I'd simply also underline the importance of how we do development, Mr. Speaker. Very, very troubling. Very recently as last week, we understand from the government, it was definitely a government decision, a political decision, that we're going to focus more of our development in the region of Kandahar. We're going to go from 17% of our development dollars being spent in Kandahar to 50%. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to note CEDA has had difficulty finding partners to do development in Kandahar because of the conflict. It's passing strange then that if we've had problems getting development dollars spent in Kandahar, that the government would politically choose to take 50% of our development dollars and posit them in Kandahar at a time when we can't spend the dollars that we already had to spend there. And it underlines the point that I think Mr. Manley talked about in his report and others have talked about in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and that is the issue of signature projects. Mr. Speaker, we're going down the path of signature projects at a time when we should be going the other way. Granted, there are important infrastructure projects to be done, but they need not be done under the guise of Canada, delivering these projects to Afghans. They should be done by the Afghan people themselves. Signature projects, Mr. Speaker, as we've learned, recent articles in the Globe and Mail and Citizen, other CanWest papers, will attract more trouble. In fact, if you look at the issue of the pipeline that hasn't been sufficiently debated in this House, I brought it up before, it is now getting some attention. That is the natural gas pipeline going from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan, can become a security problem for all of us. And it is along the lines of these signature projects, these big projects, which my belief is that they're targets for people like the Taliban. You're building targets is what you're doing. Why? These signature projects are being used by insurgents, by the Taliban, as targets of what they would call imperialism or intervention or for their own propaganda, of which, of course, I would disagree with the concept of what we're trying to do, but the outcome is what we have to look at, Mr. Speaker. What we should do, instead of these big signature projects the government wants us to engage in, which become targets for the Taliban and others, what we should be doing is employing as many Afghans as we can at their level with the requisite technology that they have, not hiring big contractors who basically suck money right out of Afghanistan and go to other capitals around the world. And make no mistake, that's exactly what's happening with a lot of our aid. That's what these signature projects do. We should be doing, and there are some models in Afghanistan presently. The National Solidarity Project, which we've funded to some extent, shows how you can make decisions at the local level, employ people at the local level, and benefit people at the local level. We heard this at committee. But I have no idea when we have this evidence in front of committee on the one hand, when we know that Afghans, and I was there just recently, and there was a clear message from the president right through to the regional councillors that they didn't want to see more contractors coming in to build big projects. What they wanted to see was a maximum number of Afghans being employed. And I guess, Mr. Speaker, it again is passing strange that when you hear this from Afghans, when you hear this evidence at committee, when you hear it from experts, a consensus that we should be moving away from these large projects, these signature projects, and move into community-based decision-making, getting into development that leads to security, because when Afghans build it themselves, they own it, and we know, we have evidence that those projects are more secure, that the Taliban won't go after those projects. When we see that, we see our government saying, no, 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 we know better. We're going to move our aid, which was 17% dedicated to Kandahar, we're going to move that to 50%. I can't comprehend what the government is trying to achieve here, other than for its own purposes of trying to win the hearts and minds of Canadians as opposed to the hearts and minds of Afghans. Mr. Speaker, it was also brought forward at committee the importance of having a diplomatic part to our mission in Afghanistan. And it troubles me to say this, having just returned from the region. The men and women who are charged and responsible for the mission there, the military, are doing the best they can. They are working very hard. They are 2,500 approximately of the troops there. What I didn't see on the ground was a sufficient number of people who are involved in diplomacy and building the capacity for peace and reconstruction. What I found interesting, Mr. Speaker, is that what the government calls the whole-of-government approach now. It's moved from 3Ds, and now we have whole-of-government, and I'm sure in a couple of weeks we'll have new nomenclature to fit the needs of the political agenda. But the whole-of-government approach, Mr. Speaker, was pitched as being this way to bring all partners together, and so that, all equal will have joint leadership, the power will be distributed amongst all, and this will be a better model. Well, like many things, Mr. Speaker, theory and practice. In practice, what I found is that the team, as they call it, on the ground consists of, sure, DFATE. Yes, there's the military. There is CETA folks there. But interestingly, Mr. Speaker, there's also representatives from the State Department. This is on their own org charts, the Canadian org charts that they hand out. This is State Department officials. These are people from USAID who are there, and people there who are mentoring the police from the U.S. Now, I mention this, Mr. Speaker, because most Canadians aren't aware of the fact that when we talk about the whole-of-government approach at committee, when the government uses that term, it's not the whole of Canadian government working with the Afghans. It's the whole of the integration between the Americans and Canadians on the ground now in Kandahar. I was more than surprised to find out that this was happening. Further to that, Mr. Speaker, as you know, there's a separate parallel mission that the Americans have, which is their insurance to make sure they're the ones running the show in the region in Kandahar, and that is Operation Enduring Freedom. One wonders if this is a UN-sanctioned NATO mission that everyone likes to refer to, why do we have at that same time a separate parallel mission going on from the United States? Why do they have Operation Enduring Freedom still going? Remember, Mr. Speaker, Operation Enduring Freedom was supposed to be there initially to go in and, as they say in American verbiage terms, go get the bad guys and clear them out, right? It's the kind of cowboy rhetoric. What happened, Mr. Speaker, is that was supposed to end as the UN ISAF forces moved in. It was supposed to, kind of fade away, melt away. Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to underline the point that that's not happening. In fact, what we're seeing, and I was surprised to see this, is that not only is OEF still going strong, a separate American mission, separate from the United Nations ISAF, is that they're actually integrated into some of the work that we're doing on the ground vis-a-vis financing the training of the police in Afghanistan to the tune of $8 billion. Now, I have, again, no idea why we have our people working with Operation Enduring Freedom programs and why Operation Enduring Freedom, which is a military mission, is responsible for training the police, which has been hands down one of the biggest challenges in Afghanistan, the training of police. So, Mr. Speaker, we see that this has become and morphing into not what is always trumpeted and underlined by the government as a UN-sanctioned NATO, ISAF mission, which in part it is, but they forget to tell us and talk about the other part, and that is the direction that the American mission of OEF is providing, not just the military side, which again I find surprising is not talked about, but on the training and funding of police. Why is that the case? Why are we doing that? And what it leads to, Mr. Speaker, is what we have is this direction of the Americans not only funding the training of police, but also directing the mission. So, Mr. Speaker, what this committee report showed from witnesses was the need for Canada to change direction, the need for Canada to abandon this military imposed, in many ways, solution, which is no solution at all, that Canada needs to reclaim its voice to ensure that instead of just carrying along, beside Operation Enduring Freedom, yes, sir, 3 bags full, sir, that we make sure that we have an independent foreign policy that will actually provide stability. This isn't about bringing democracy to Afghanistan. And any day of the week you get a different answer from this government about why we're there. Sometimes it's we're bringing democracy to Afghanistan or education to women or girls or, every day you get a new thing. It's about providing stability. So, Mr. Speaker, what we need to see from this government is an acknowledgement of what others have already said, and that is change direction, embrace the notion of peace building, and for goodness sakes, get on our own feet with our own independent foreign policy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Outremont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask my colleague to explain the operation of 2 operations at the same time. One we hear about a lot. This is a NATO mission and the UN mission, but at the same time, in the wake of September 2001, the Americans implemented Operation Enduring Freedom. Could he explain the problem that represents for a country like Canada, Canada that has had a reputation for peacekeeping the world? How could we get involved in search and destroy missions? And the Canadian soldiers are involved in the same thing. We're not going to find out this from our state television. The only way that Canadians found out what's going on is that when the French television filmed the Canadian Army participating in this process. Could my colleague explain the problem that this creates for the image of Canada and for any possibility to work for sustainable peace in Afghanistan?
Well, I want to thank my colleague from Outremont for his question, because what Canadians don't realize is on the ground, beyond the spin and the flow charts that the government will provide to us, is the evidence is the following. What we have is the parallel mission of Operation Enduring Freedom, funding, training, and continuing on with their approach, which is a search and kill. And I think, Mr. Speaker, it's important to underline, and I asked a question to President Karzai when we met with him just over a week ago, and I said to him, are you concerned with the tactics of the Americans vis-a-vis their airstrikes and what they're doing to villages, be it in Kandahar or throughout the country? Unequivocally, and the colleagues from the Conservatives were there and from the Bloc and from the Liberals, he said, absolutely. He said, what they're doing is creating more harm. That was the President of the country. What he implored was to have the Americans change their method. His hands are tied, Mr. Speaker, because they're off doing their own thing without any oversight with Operation Enduring Freedom. They're only having to, well, you know who the answer to. It's the Commander-in-Chief, and we know his success in foreign affairs. He's done just a great job in Iraq, and he's pursuing the same kind of procedure and process and tactics in Afghanistan. So make no mistake that the effects of the American tactics are affecting what we're doing there. And the equation is much more complicated than this government's providing. I think it's important for Canadians to know that. I know that our men and women would prefer to pursue an independent Canadian strategy than having to have this parallel effect, this spillover, this Doppler effect that is happening in Afghanistan. And I think Canadians need to know that. I think this government has to be more truthful about it. And I think when they find out, when Canadians find out, they'll be, as you know, even less supportive than they already are of this mission in Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I had the great honour to be raised by my grandmother, who grew up in the HoC Hill slums in Dundee, Scotland. And my grandmother used to tell me the stories again and again and again of the British Army coming in and getting her cousins, her neighbours, every boy in her neighbourhood. And she said, and they all went to the Somme and they never came home again. And she taught me from day one. She said, anybody tells you to rally around the flag and ask no questions, that's the time to start asking questions. And I raised that story, Mr. Speaker, because I was in the House the night of the debate on Afghanistan, and we asked simple questions like, where are the allies? And what we heard from the Conservative government, they called us the 21st century Neville Chamberlains. They chanted slogans like boots on the ground. And they said, we don't cut and run. And I thought, especially for the member of Central Nova coming from Nova Scotia, which does have a good maritime tradition, they would understand what the meaning of the term cut and run. Mr. Speaker, you cut and run when your ship is anchored and you're in a storm. And you have to cut the anchor and run before the wind, otherwise you go into the rocks. So a captain who tells you he won't cut and run is a captain who's not fit for command, because he's running you straight into the rocks. So that when we were asking simple questions about Operation Enduring Freedom, we were getting, we don't cut and run, which is obviously we are running into a very bad situation, but we're too bullheaded to turn around. And when we ask questions as our job as opposition, we're denounced and shouted down as unpatriotic and not willing to rally around the flag. So I'd like to ask the honourable member, we asked those questions. Where were the allies? And 6 months later, the government stands up and says, where are the allies? We asked questions about Operation Enduring Freedom and the search and destroy mission and how it's destabilizing the reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan, and this government said we were all friends of the Taliban. Now we're seeing that when this member is speaking with the president of Afghanistan and asking him about the search and destroy missions, he's sharing the same concerns we have. Why is it, does he think, that the Conservative government continues to move in such a wrong-headed direction that is actually sending the ship straight towards the rocks?
I hope that the honourable member for Ottawa Centre can give a short reply for this so we can get questions from other members from other parties.
I'll do my best as always, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your guidance. I also want to thank my colleague from Timmins for clarifying for members of the Commons, particularly on the government side, about the history of that term and what it really means, cut and run. But to his question, Mr. Speaker, I think the problem here is that I think it was in the Manley report, in fact I know it was the Manley report, that stated the following: for whatever reason, and I think it was deliberate in choice of words, we ended up in Kandahar. And I think that's instructive, Mr. Speaker, because we had no idea, and I think this was actually the problem for the previous government that we all inherited, that they hadn't a clue as to what we were going to do when we got there. And we still have problems in understanding what we're doing there. So what do? We fall back on the people who are there already. And what we're going to see, Mr. Speaker, I can predict, is that we're going to see more of this influence. This is not going to be a NATO mission anymore. This is wholeheartedly going to become an American-led mission. We see that, and we see it in very, very direct ways.
and comments. The Honourable the Parliamentary Secretary. Well, we're still into questions and comments, and I recognize the Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre. There are 3 minutes left for both the question and the answer.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I can be fairly brief. I was simply going to point out, Mr. Speaker, I appreciated hearing my colleague from Timmins, James Bay, recount what the wisdom that his grandmother shared with him. I too would like to begin my comment and then question by saying that my father was volunteered to go to the Second World War in 1939. He stayed for the whole term, ended up coming home late 1945. The Second World War had the country seized for what seemed like an eternity, but in actual fact it was 6 years. We've been in Afghanistan longer than my father was away in the Second World War, honestly, and that was a war that obviously engaged the entire world and almost leveled Europe. Now, we have to ask ourselves the same question that we began by asking, which I remember very well in 2001, 2002. The very questions we were putting to the government is, if we are going to be engaged in this country, for how long, what is the end strategy, and what is the yardstick by which we will measure progress? It seemed like a reasonable, simple thing. If you're asking us to engage in an open war, at least those 3 questions, any reasonable planner would want to be able to answer those clearly. Can he share with me, at this point in time, 7 years later, are we any closer to an answer to those 3 basic questions?
The Honourable Member for Ottawa Centre has 1 minute to respond.
Well, Mr. Speaker, very quickly, no, we don't have any clarity on that. All we have is government being supported by the opposition to carry this on till 2011. You talk about the commitment of the Second World War, of which my father served, and both my grandfathers served in the First War. They served with honor, but what the problem with this government has is that they don't really know why we're there, and they don't have a plan about where we're going. And that's deeply disturbing, Mr. Speaker, because they've been government for a couple of years. The previous government had their turn on it. So the questions are still the same. What is it that we're trying to achieve there? How long? And what is the measure of success? That has been elusive for this government. And I think Canadians are losing trust in this government because they can't answer those basic questions that I think every single Canadian, particularly those who serve in the military, need to know. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Looming debate. The Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs has... The Honourable, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs is on the floor for 20 minutes, including 2 minutes today.
The Honourable Member for Outremont has the floor for a point of order. I was very clearly standing before, and you saw that. You saw that clearly. I'd like to know what standing order you're basing your decision on.
Mr. Speaker, this member asked what Canadians need to know, and I would like to tell what Canadians need to know. Aside from their absolutely idiotic nonsense, I want to ask them this question. Why are they abusing the privilege of the Parliament of Canada, Mr. Speaker? And let me explain what I'm talking about, Mr. Speaker. This report that he's talking about is, Mr. Speaker, a preliminary report that was done by the Foreign Affairs Committee tabled in January. From January onwards till Thursday, day before yesterday, Mr. Speaker, we had a final report that was of this member was sitting in the report, which has 37 recommendations that will be tabled in here. All this nonsense rhetoric they're talking about, he had all this opportunity to talk in that report, which will be tabled. That would be the final report. Now, I want to ask him, why did he put all those recommendations in that final report, Mr. Speaker? That report is going to be tabled out here, which is the right place to do, the right way to do as a parliamentarian. He, Mr. Speaker, is abusing the privilege that he wants because he wants to talk about his rhetoric that he did not talk when the whole committee made its recommendation. If he has a problem, like all his colleagues are asking over there, I want to ask them, why are they not put that in the minority report that will be tabled in 2 weeks' time in this House, Mr. Speaker? But why are they abusing the time they have in this Parliament so we could talk more issues, important issues, like the carbon tax or something like that, Mr. Speaker, which is relevant out here. He had the opportunity, he had the floor, he refused to do anything out there, and now he's abusing this thing. The absolute nonsense rhetoric that they're talking about. Second factor, Mr. Speaker, the Parliament of Canada has spoken. On March...
I'd like to remind the Honourable the Parliamentary Secretary that the Speaker is standing, and that's a good time for him to sit. It is my duty to interrupt the proceedings on the motion at this moment. Accordingly, the debate on the motion will be rescheduled for another sitting, at which time there will still be 18.5 minutes left for the Honourable the Parliamentary Secretary.
In response to the point of order from the member for Outremont, I recognized the Parliamentary Secretary instead of the member because it was his turn to speak.
31. The House will now proceed to the consideration of private members' business as listed on today's order paper. Orders of the day.
Private members' business. First time debate on Bill C-303, Early Learning and Childcare Act, in the name of Ms. Savoy.
The Honourable Member for Victoria is not present to move the order as announced in today's notice paper. Accordingly, the bill will be dropped to the bottom of the order of precedence on the order paper. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Council is rising on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, seeing that there will be no private members' bills going forward, and the members in the House here today are so anxious to get back and serve their good constituents in their respective ridings, might the House see the clock at 2:30?
This is a very good offer that the honourable member for Cape Breton Council is making. He'll be happy to know that he doesn't even have to make the offer. I'd like to share with him a moment of levity from yesterday. At 5:30, the Chief Opposition Whip rose to see the clock, and I almost entertained for better offers. She wanted to see the clock at 5:30. She wanted to see the clock at 6:30, and I almost asked the House if I could get a better offer. But now we've got it, and it being one. No. There's something else I want to tell you. Vous voulez? J'aimerais vous souhaiter.
I'd like to wish you a good summer.
I want to convey to you an invitation that comes from the Speaker. He's waiting for you in room 216, where he would like to wish you a happy summer personally. It being 1:34 p.m., the House stands adjourned until Monday, September 15th, 2008, at 11 a.m., pursuant to Standing Orders 28.2 and 24.1.